A gust of wind swept through, and the wanderer felt a powerful force striking directly at his head. Judging by the aura it carried, if it hit, his head would undoubtedly explode like a watermelon. While many people enjoy eating watermelons, surely no one would want their head to resemble one smashed into pieces by a devastating blow. Helplessly, the wanderer withdrew the longsword he had thrust forward, sidestepping. Quickly. The hooves of Golden A landed less than a meter from him, leaving 2 deep imprints on the ground. Perhaps it was because the wanderer seemed to underestimate it, or perhaps Golden A believed that protecting its master was its duty. Either way, in the midst of the fight between the two, Golden A suddenly charged forward, leaping up and stomping down with all its might. At this moment, Golden A's eyes were fierce, entirely unlike those of an ordinary horse. It resembled a wolf, or, at best, a rabid dog. Golden A misstepped, its strong legs momentarily numbed. Before it could decide whether to turn around and deliver an even stronger back kick to teach this scoundrel a lesson, the wanderer had already struck it with a sharp elbow to the head. Golden A let out a pitiful cry and collapsed, its front legs struggling to support its body. In the end, its head slammed hard against the ground. The wanderer's fury was indescribable. A brat from who knows where had embarrassed him, and now even a beast dared to launch a sneak attack. What enraged him even more was that a flicker of fear in his heart had caused him to lose his usual composure. His moves appeared clumsy, failing to unleash his full strength, otherwise, this damn horse should have died instantly, not just collapsed on the ground, panting as if ready to bite. He didn't think for long because there was still an enemy in front of him, a real enemy. Even John Rivers hadn't anticipated that, in a moment of desperation, Golden A would suddenly intervene. After all, this horse and he had never gotten along, it could absolutely be said they despised each other. Yet it was this annoying but undeniably spirited creature that gave him a chance. John Rivers seized this opportunity. Just as Golden A fell, John Rivers charged forward. This time, he didn't throw a punch or kick but instead used a single finger, channeling all his strength into the attack. This finger was his trump card, his one and only ultimate technique. Although still in its infancy, the power of the stone void finger was absolutely not to be underestimated. The wandering warrior noticed John Rivers' actions. Using his right elbow, he struck down Golden A. By habit, his long sword was in his right hand, but given his current posture, it was clearly unsuitable for exerting force with the sword technique. Forced into such a situation, the wandering warrior no longer cared about anything else. He was determined to make both the man and the horse meet an utterly miserable end. As an entry-stage martial artist, standing before a novice martial practitioner like John Rivers, the wandering warrior had absolute confidence in the resilience of his body. Even if he stood still and let John Rivers punch him 300 times, his body would remain unscathed. This was the gap created by their differing levels of mastery. Thus, he paid no heed to John Rivers' attack. Despite his awkward posture and improper angle, he still thrust his sword forward, aiming for John Rivers' left shoulder. Slowly, he thought, he would first leave him covered in wounds, then bit by bit, make this kid taste the flavor of death. That was the wandering warrior's plan. And he wasn't wrong. Even if John Rivers fought desperately, his meager inner energy couldn't harm the wandering warrior's body. At most, it caused a slight pain, but nothing more. However, the wandering warrior, consumed by rage, had let his fury burn away his reason. He forgot one critical detail: John Rivers wasn't charging toward him to punch, but to strike his pressure point. To get his finger to touch the wandering warrior, John Rivers gritted his teeth and ignored the opponent's longsword entirely. He knew this was likely his only chance. If he couldn't seize the moment while the opponent was unguarded and use a mutual destruction tactic to turn the tide, the next one lying on the ground wouldn't just be Golden A. The longsword pierced John Rivers' shoulder, going straight through, blood splattering everywhere. Even as his body was impaled by the sword, John Rivers pressed on, resolutely jabbing his index finger into the wandering warrior's left chest. That is the position of the heart. The moment his finger touched the chest of the wanderer suddenly sensed something unusual. Relying on the instincts of someone at the entry stage, he finally realized that the force hidden within the opponent's finger far exceeded his imagination. There wasn't enough time for him to react. He could only try his best to condense his inner energy to resist that finger. The wanderer's mind went blank. He couldn't understand why he had been so careless, allowing himself to be pushed to such a desperate state by a martial artist who was clearly just a novice. Then, his mind sank into eternal oblivion. With a single strike, John Rivers' finger pierced through the ribs of the wanderer, stabbing into the beating mass of flesh within. Moments later, the wanderer's heart shattered into countless fragments. With a confused gaze, the wanderer watched as John Rivers withdrew his finger, also noticing the bloody hole in his own chest. He opened his mouth, but could not make a sound, his knees buckled, and he collapsed heavily to the ground. After defeating and killing the first opponent he encountered, John Rivers felt no excitement, let alone the urge to celebrate. Because he was in excruciating pain. A long sword had pierced almost entirely through his body, and the blade carried inner energy that had inflicted damage on his internal organs. Anyone in his position would likely be in tears from the agony. John Rivers didn't even dare to move. Although he had seen countless movies where tough characters gritted their teeth and pulled arrows, knives, or foreign objects from their bodies, he knew that was all just acting. If he truly acted with such bravado and pulled the long sword out now, he would surely collapse from the overwhelming pain and lose consciousness. What would happen after he fainted was easy to imagine. Although Goldeneye wasn't dead yet, he wasn't some magical being capable of bandaging wounds. Thus, John Rivers' only fate would be death from excessive blood loss. John Rivers opened his mouth wide, feeling as though breathing had become increasingly difficult. He suddenly felt very tired. The pain was gradually fading, replaced by an overwhelming drowsiness. He must not sleep. If he slept, he would never wake up again. This line was one John Rivers had seen countless times in movies, so he told himself he must endure and absolutely must not close his eyes. He kept thinking like that, unable to sleep, reminding himself to keep his eyes wide open. Then, he fell asleep. John Rivers' action had an astonishing effect. The highwayman stood there, momentarily dumbfounded. However, the atmosphere grew a bit awkward. Unable to maintain his smile any longer, John Rivers forced his stiff jaw to move and asked, "Who are you?" Just moments ago, he had acted as if demanding others to pay him respect and wealth, but now he arrogantly questioned someone else's identity. This kind of mental leap was clearly not something everyone could follow. For instance, the masked highwayman seemed a bit confused. But regardless, seeing the foolish boy's demeanor clearly filled with disdain for him, how could he let this slide without teaching him a lesson? "If you hand over all the money you have, I might let you live and pass through," the masked man declared with bold confidence. "Moreover, you can even take your horse with you," he added, emphasizing his point. "You dare show your face to me?" Ethan Stone's face suddenly became animated. The usually stoic man now clearly displayed his anger. John Rivers looked around in confusion. A mist swirled lazily, resembling the early morning fog that had yet to lift, with the sunlight still faint and subdued. "Master, why are you dead too?" John Rivers recalled everything that had happened to him, unable to suppress his shock. He had died without understanding how, but what misfortune could have befallen his master? Ethan Stone snapped angrily, "You still dare to speak? Taking in an incompetent disciple like you, of course, I could only die from frustration. Who would have thought that I, the #1 master, would meet such a pitiful end? If I had known, I would have killed you with a single strike back then." John Rivers' face twisted awkwardly, resembling a monkey's rear, as he stayed silent. He truly had no idea how to respond. Ethan Stone, still fuming, extended a hand, holding a cup of tea. "Drink it already." John Rivers eyed the murky brown liquid in the bowl with curiosity and asked, "What is this?" "Of course, it's mangpo soup. You're at the Naiha Bridge, what else would you drink?" John Rivers jumped in alarm. "Drinking this will erase all memories of my past life, won't it? Are you kidding me? I just switched to another world to have some fun, and now you're telling me to reset everything? No way. Ethan Stone grew even angrier, grabbing John Rivers by the collar, as if intending to pour the contents of the bowl down his throat. John Rivers struggled with all his might, shouting loudly that he'd rather die than drink it. Next, he seemed to hear a silvery laugh, accompanied by a booming voice. Damn it, this big guy is making such a fuss over drinking a bowl of medicine. If he doesn't drink it, he'll surely die without needing a beating. Suddenly opening his eyes, John Rivers found himself drenched in sweat, lying on an old, rickety, bamboo bed. In front of him stood a burly man holding a bowl, and beside the man was a little girl, around 11 or 12 years old, giggling as she looked at him. John Rivers let out a sigh of relief. It seemed he wasn't dead yet. What he had just seen, his master and main post soup, was merely a dream. Thank goodness, I didn't make Master die of anger. John Rivers's pale face broke into a smile. Hashtag chapter 15, the curse comes true. I don't care who your master is. If you don't want to drive me mad, drink this medicine right now. The burly man by the bed shouted loudly, his voice full of vigor. Under the watchful eyes of the burly man and the laughter of the little girl, John Rivers grimaced as he gulped down the bowl of medicine, which he deemed the most bitter in the world. It turned out that on the day of the fierce battle with the rogue swordsman, although the process was far from graceful, the outcome was devastating. John Rivers suffered severe injuries and quickly passed out on the spot. Had he not been fortunate enough to encounter Thomas Miller, his soul would have long followed the rogue swordsman down to the underworld. Coincidentally, the mountain valley nearby was rarely traversed. That day, because someone in the village mentioned a few lost goats, Thomas Miller, a generous and chivalrous man, invited the villagers to search together. For ordinary farmers, those goats were incredibly valuable assets. Thomas Miller found no trace of the goats, but stumbled upon two people sprawled on the ground, with a horse squatting beside them. Yes, squatting. Goldeneye sat with its haunches on the ground, front legs supporting its body. When Thomas Miller saw it, the horse was in this peculiar posture. At that moment, Thomas Miller was utterly astonished. Though he considered himself a simple countryman who had seen his fair share of livestock, he had never encountered a horse sitting like a dog before. In truth, Goldeneye wasn't trying to act out of the ordinary. Earlier that day, it had been knocked down by a wandering warrior. Dazed and struggling to get up, Goldeneye managed to rise briefly, but its hind legs gave out, causing it to collapse again with a thud. Determined not to lie flat on the ground like a lifeless animal, Goldeneye stubbornly held itself in a squatting position. Its hind legs, however, refused to cooperate. Resigned, it decided to rest in this odd posture, regaining strength, before attempting to stand again. At the very least, it wanted to check on its rather inept master, to see if he was still alive. It was at this moment that Thomas Miller arrived. Upon seeing Goldeneye, he was filled with admiration. At the same time, he noticed two figures lying on the ground. The wandering warrior was, of course, long dead. John Rivers, however, though gravely injured, was still breathing. Thomas Miller helped Goldeneye to its feet and then carefully lifted John Rivers onto the horse's back. He assumed this frail-looking horse wouldn't be able to bear the weight. To his surprise, despite its dizziness, Goldeneye carried John Rivers all the way back to the village with determination. Once there, Thomas Miller quickly sought out the village healer and enlisted the help of two others to prepare for the burial of the deceased warrior. Naturally, he didn't forget to reward Goldeneye with some fresh, delicious hay. Ever the glutton, Goldeneye promptly forgot its earlier discomfort and began enjoying its well-earned feast. John Rivers' injuries were severe. The village healer, clearly lacking experience with such grave wounds, struggled as beads of sweat formed on his brow. After much effort, he finally managed to extract the sword lodged in Rivers' body, applied a strange herbal remedy to the wound, and prescribed a large amount of medicinal decoctions. That John Rivers survived this ordeal without succumbing to the healer's questionable methods was not just a stroke of luck, but also a testament to his extraordinary physique, which allowed him to endure and recover from such dire injuries. falling into a coma for 2 full days and nights. During that time, Thomas Miller had tried several times to give him medicine. Finally, on the last attempt, John Rivers woke up, shouting and refusing to take any more. Grateful to his life-saving benefactor, John Rivers, feeling weak and with his bones almost turning to jelly, attempted to get out of bed. Thomas Miller quickly stopped his reckless action, and Thomas's wife also advised John Rivers to rest. Such severe injuries wouldn't heal in just 2 or 3 weeks. Only Emily Miller, Thomas Miller's daughter, curiously observed John Rivers. Her small face lit up with a smile, as if encouraging him to try standing up. Moving his shoulder, John Rivers noticed that the wound seemed to no longer hurt. His actions alarmed the Miller couple. Did this fool intend to tear open the carefully bandaged wound? Waving his hand to signal Thomas Miller not to intervene, John Rivers pondered for a moment. Since there was no pain at all, he slowly began unwrapping the bandages covering nearly half of his body. As he expected, the wound was still there, but it had already turned into a scar. The Miller couple was stunned. No one could believe that such a penetrating wound could heal completely in just 2 days. Once again, John Rivers silently thanked Ethan Stone and Victor Sage for granting him such a robust body. Stretching his shoulder, he straightened up and stood tall. Thomas Miller had a decent amount of wealth, making him relatively well off in the village. Coupled with his generous and warm-hearted nature, along with some basic martial arts skills, he was well loved by the villagers. With the village chief growing old and frail, the entire village of over 200 households regarded Thomas Miller as their pillar of support. It was thought that even if John Rivers managed to survive his ordeal, he would need several days of rest to recover. Surprisingly, this dark-faced man regained his strength in just 2 days, as energetic as a dragon or tiger, leaving Thomas Miller astonished. However, seeing that John Rivers was truly fine, he allowed him to wander freely. Brickhead Village was small, so it didn't take long for John Rivers to acquaint himself with the villagers. Day by day, he visited different households, occasionally helping with heavy labor. The days passed by in a carefree manner. Golden A, however, remained in Thomas Miller's stable, eating and sleeping all day, showing no interest in John Rivers. The once majestic horse that had loyally protected its master now seemed indifferent, leaving John Rivers puzzled and curious about the animal's peculiar behavior. One day, John Rivers made a kite and played with Emily Miller. The little girl was full of joy, and the village children, already familiar with John Rivers, eagerly joined the kite-flying fun without needing an invitation. A dozen or so children surrounded John Rivers, laughing and playing with great excitement. Tired from playing, John Rivers watched the children still enthusiastically flying kites, shouting and running around. A sense of peace washed over him, and he thought to himself that life like this wasn't so bad after all. When Thomas Miller returned home and saw John Rivers, he greeted him and asked Margaret Miller to prepare a few snacks. The 2 men then sat in the yard, drinking together. In his previous world, John Rivers had been a lover of social drinking. Now, with his strong and healthy body, he enjoyed drinking even more. Thomas Miller, a hearty man used to eating and drinking in large quantities, was a perfect match for him. They got along exceptionally well. Before long, a jar of wine had been emptied between the two. After spending days together, John Rivers felt that Thomas Miller was a genuinely good person. Of course, this goodness wasn't just about his drinking capacity. And so, John Rivers finally asked the question he had always wanted to ask. "Why did you save me that day?" The question wasn't meant to doubt Thomas Miller's chivalrous heart, but rather because, at that moment, lying beside John Rivers was the corpse of a wanderer. To the people of the continent, the identity of a wanderer symbolized justice, and anyone who killed a wanderer would naturally be pushed to the opposite side of justice. Thomas Miller wiped his mouth. "I knew you'd ask that, but I didn't expect you could hold it in for so many days." "Not bad," he said with a loud laugh. Already accustomed to Thomas Miller's booming voice, John Rivers also laughed, waiting for an answer. "The reasoning is actually quite simple," Thomas Miller said, his face turning serious. Looking at you, your clothes aren't something an ordinary person could afford. Your skin, though a bit dark, isn't rough from years of enduring the elements. Judging by your age, around 17 or 18, I guessed you must be the son of a noble family. John Rivers scratched his head. Even if I were a noble son, killing someone shouldn't go without explanation. Moreover, the person who died was a true wanderer. Thomas Miller let out a cold laugh, even his snort louder than most people's voices. Only a naive child like you would think wanderers are always the embodiment of knights, bound by rules and traditions passed down for thousands of years. Do you really believe such things are still upheld today? John Rivers seemed to somewhat understand Thomas Miller's point, so, it turns out, wanderers aren't necessarily all good people. Perhaps wanderers of the old days were surrounded by an aura of heroism, but as time passes, human nature changes. The glory and fame built on passion and courage inevitably fade over time. The man who died at your hands, I've met him before, Thomas Miller said as he poured drinks for himself and John Rivers, then raised his cup and drank it all in one go. I knew that man wasn't anything good. John Rivers's curiosity was piqued. What bad thing did he do? Thomas Miller shook his head. It's not about what he did, but rather what he didn't do. It turned out that a few days earlier, a group of children from the village had gone to swim in the lake east of the village. One of them had a cramp while in the water. The child only knew how to swim a little and, in that moment of panic, flailed helplessly, unable to stay afloat, and began crying out in fear. The other children, seeing this, quickly shouted for help. A few who were better swimmers jumped into the water to save their friend. However, they were all just kids, and in the chaos, their efforts were disorganized. The unlucky child struggling in the water ended up swallowing more water and flailing around so much that the rescuers couldn't manage to pull him up. At that moment, it was fortunate that Thomas Miller and a few villagers happened to pass by. They immediately jumped into the water to rescue the drowning child. Naturally, the elders in the village scolded the children for their recklessness. Meanwhile, Thomas Miller's gaze remained fixed on a large tree not far away. Underneath the tree stood a man on horseback, silently watching. Looking at the attire, Thomas Miller recognized that it was a wanderer, but he couldn't understand why the wanderer's face was covered with a black cloth. In his impression, wanderers shouldn't be the type to hide their identity in such a way. What puzzled Thomas Miller even more was that, according to the children's accounts, when they cried for help, the wanderer was already under the tree but acted as if he didn't hear anything, remaining indifferent and motionless. What enraged Thomas Miller was that when the drowning child was rescued and brought ashore, the wanderer's eyes seemed to hold a trace of regret, a look very much like that of someone expecting an exciting spectacle, only to find out there was none. Although deeply dissatisfied and contemptuous of the man's behavior, Thomas Miller was not a reckless person. He knew that confronting or lecturing the other party would not be a wise move. For someone who had lost the courage of a wanderer and could stand idly by in the face of death, such a person was naturally capable of committing even more outrageous acts. Thus, Thomas Miller could only curse in anger at the retreating figure disappearing into the distance. A few days later, he discovered that his curse had come true. That wanderer had indeed died a gruesome death. ##### Chapter 16, Those who stay humble age gracefully. Anyway, having a hole in the chest could be considered as dying without an intact body. Thus, Thomas Miller immediately decided to save the faintly breathing life of John Rivers. Someone who helps fulfill your good wishes can be called a benefactor, but what should you call someone who turns your curses into reality? Surely, they can't be called a scoundrel, can they? Thomas Miller ignored such thoughts and, without hesitation, brought John Rivers home to treat his injuries. In any case, Thomas Miller's reasoning had already fully explained why he decided to save someone who had killed a wandering knight. There was a time when wandering knights were heroes in the hearts of countless people, truly the embodiment of justice. Unfortunately, wherever there are people, there will be both good and bad individuals. This also holds true for the group of wandering knights. Only fools believe all wandering knights are good people, Thomas Miller loudly mocked. Damn it, my eyes are sharp. I absolutely won't misjudge someone. That guy, just one look and you can tell he's no good. John Rivers slapped his thigh and laughed heartily. Then you must think I'm a good person. Otherwise, why would you save me and even invite me for a drink? Thomas Miller laughed as well. Even if you're not a good person, you're definitely not a villain. Besides, after drinking my wine, even a bad guy would turn into a good one. The two good men laughed loudly in the courtyard at sunset, drinking from large bowls. John Rivers even drank more than Thomas Miller. Margaret Miller sat nearby, sometimes watching the two cheerful men and sometimes observing the children playing. A constant smile adorned her face. Her smile was filled with simple happiness. So, you're saying not only did your master abandon you in a desolate place, but you also don't have a single penny on you? Thomas Miller stared in astonishment. John Rivers could only nod. Damn, your master is really something else, Thomas Miller remarked. This time, it was John Rivers' turn to look surprised. How is that considered good for me? At least he left you with a horse and a proper set of clothes. What more do you want? Thomas Miller raised an eyebrow. John Rivers was at a loss for words. Was everyone here crazy? A master who casually abandoned his disciple so irresponsibly was actually being praised. I don't know what kind of person your master is, Thomas Miller said, taking another swig of wine, his eyes lighting up. But I do know that true heroes rely on their own abilities to build their legacy. Like Alexander King back in the day, he was just a starving beggar as a child. Compared to him, you've already got so much more. John Rivers forced a bitter smile, thinking to himself, I have no desire to become some great emperor but the idea of an emperor with such a tragic past, who didn't even have that inglorious chapter erased by historians, was truly admirable. Not wanting to continue the topic, John Rivers quickly changed the subject, starting to talk about how the old village chief's cow seemed to be about to give birth. Thomas Miller threw the wine bowl to the ground, startling John Rivers. So young, yet so lazy. Look at your hands, not a single callus, soft and smooth skin. Clearly, you're from a wealthy and noble family. If you keep wasting your youth like this, how can you be worthy of your lineage? Thomas Miller appeared genuinely angry. John Rivers found it amusing. In this world, he didn't even have any relatives, let alone some so-called prestigious family. Wealth and nobility? That was far from his reality, he'd simply been lucky, that's all. As Thomas Miller continued, his frustration grew, repeatedly scolding John Rivers for his lack of ambition, his aimlessness, and his failure to appreciate his master's care. His voice grew louder and faster, making John Rivers feel as if he were caught in the midst of a storm, his ears ringing from the thunderous reprimands. Fortunately, Margaret Miller intervened to calm the situation. Otherwise, with Thomas Miller's fiery temperament, who knew how long his tirade would have lasted? At that moment, Zhao Kuei from the east end of the village came rushing into the yard, clutching a carrying pole tightly in his hand. Mr. Miller! Mr. Miller! Something terrible has happened. Before Thomas Miller could even stand up, Zhao Kuei shouted urgently. John Rivers, still slightly drunk, teased him, Don't panic, kids. Could it be that Sun Wukong has attacked the cave? Zhao Kuei, not understanding what monkey he was referring to, simply grabbed Thomas Miller's sleeve and pulled him outside. Thomas Miller, confused, held him back and told him to calmly explain what had happened. Zhao Kuei was so anxious that sweat was dripping down his face. There's no time to waste. It's the ox head. Ox head. As soon as Thomas Miller heard this, his expression changed. He grabbed the iron rod leaning against the wall and rushed out with Zhao Kuei. Margaret Miller, in a panic, called the children playing in the yard back into the house, her voice trembling slightly. John Rivers had no idea what was going on, he only knew that the village chief's cow was about to give birth. But could it really give birth to just a cow's head? Even so, was it worth such panic? Seeing Thomas Miller heading out with a weapon in hand, John Rivers thought it wouldn't be wise to go empty-handed. He quickly went back into his house, grabbed his long sword, and hurried after him. This sword was originally carried by a wandering swordsman whom John had killed. At that time, Thomas Miller didn't dare pull the sword out of the man's body, so they brought it back along with the scabbard. Unexpectedly, it was now coming in handy. Feeling a bit excited, John Rivers muttered to himself, ox head, could this really be a demon-slaying mission? However, upon reaching the edge of the village, he saw no trace of any demon. Instead, there were dozens of burly men on horseback, armed with machetes and exuding a menacing aura. Though the village chief was elderly, he clearly understood the situation and was diligently fulfilling his responsibility. He stood outside the village, blocking the aggressive group, speaking with their leader. Behind the village chief, more than 20 young men from the village had gathered. Armed with wooden poles and crowbars, their faces were filled with anger and determination, ready to fight. Thomas Miller strode forward, standing beside the village chief, and shouted loudly, "Ox head. Do you have no honor? It's only been 2 months, and you're back already, what's the meaning of this?" John Rivers suddenly understood. So Oxhead was just a nickname for someone. Damn, how mundane. The man called Oxhead appeared to be the leader. Sitting arrogantly on his horse, his face was full of disdain and contempt. "Thomas Miller, I respect you as a brave man, but don't overestimate your importance. Yes, I did say I'd only collect taxes from your village once every 6 months. But now I've changed my mind. What can you do about it?" Oxhead roared out the last 4 words aggressively, making it clear he was determined to intimidate Thomas Miller. Thomas Miller was furious. If the village chief hadn't held him back, the iron staff in his hand would have already smashed into Oxhead's horse, or perhaps even Oxhead himself. The night is called Oxhead, it seems Oxhead and Horseface truly make a pair. John Rivers swaggered forward, carrying his sword lazily as he strolled into the middle of the 2 opposing factions, both ready to draw their weapons. A wandering swordsman? Oxhead immediately tensed up. With just one glance, he recognized the sword resting on John Rivers' shoulder. That design, it was the standard longsword of a wandering swordsman. Seeing both groups fix their eyes on him, John Rivers' vanity swelled to its peak. He thought to himself that if he wanted to enjoy this kind of attention more often in the future, perhaps he should put in more effort to train diligently. With an air of arrogance, John Rivers started forward. Stopping in his tracks, John Rivers casually shielded the old village chief behind him. It wasn't out of disdain for the elder, but rather because he feared that if a fight broke out, the frail old man might not even have time to dodge before being struck down. Understanding his intentions, the old village chief said nothing. However, his furious gaze now carried a trace of worry. The villagers all knew that John Rivers had once fought a life-and-death duel with another wandering swordsman and emerged victorious. Still, there were many opponents this time. No matter how skilled one was, 2 fists could hardly fend off 4 hands. They couldn't help but feel concerned for John Rivers. As for John Rivers himself, he felt no tension at all. The alcohol coursing through his veins made him revel in the attention, even feeling slightly euphoric. Had he not been drinking, John Rivers might not have appeared so calm and fearless. But because he had consumed a fair amount of liquor, he had lost his sense of judgment and forgotten his own limitations. This behavior of John Rivers would have been described in his old world with 2 words, showing off. Immersed in the thrill of showing off, John Rivers was oblivious to one thing: those who bask in arrogance often pay a steep price. Oxhead was a bandit. Unlike ordinary bandits, he was a bandit leader. Though a bandit leader was still a bandit, they were clearly on a different level, different mindset, different skills. Take the current situation, for example. The lackeys behind Oxhead were already itching to chop John Rivers into pieces, but with just a single gesture, Oxhead stopped their reckless actions. A wandering swordsman might be easy to deal with, but one must not forget that these wandering swordsmen had guilds. Moreover, their enthusiasm for forming alliances was no less than that of bandits. If they dealt with this wandering swordsman now, what would happen if his comrades came seeking revenge later? Oxhead, though a bandit leader with ambition and spirit, lacked the courage to confront an entire group of wandering warriors. He knew all too well that doing so would be tantamount to suicide. Thus, when John Rivers approached, Oxhead chose to remain silent. While he could hold his tongue, John Rivers, on the other hand, could not restrain himself from speaking. At this point, asking him to shut up might be harder than killing him. "You're the leader? Come down here," John Rivers pointed at Oxhead, shouting loudly. His demeanor was no different from that of a city official barging into a group of street vendors, imposing, arrogant, and brimming with self-importance, to the point where words could hardly describe his audacity. Behind Oxhead, the faces of his brothers were almost red with fury. Their hands gripped their weapons so tightly that they trembled slightly, their anger barely contained. To them, this young man's blatant disrespect toward their leader was a clear invitation to death. Yet, Oxhead saw things differently from his comrades. He dismounted his horse and even managed to muster a smile. "Sir," Oxhead said politely, "we're just trying to make a living. If we've offended you in any way, I hope you'll forgive us." On the continent, the term "sir" was a respectful address used for warriors, merchants, scholars, and even beggars. For a bandit who barely knew how to read, Oxhead's ability to express himself this way was already commendable. Moreover, his scarred and rugged face somehow managed to display a genuine smile, an effort that was anything but easy. Chapter 17, The Intention to Leave. John Rivers was very pleased with Oxhead's attitude. As a gesture of affirmation, he patted Oxhead on the shoulder twice, much like a senior commending a junior or a superior rewarding a subordinate. Oxhead grinned widely. "Everyone struggles to make a living out there, I understand that," John Rivers said boisterously. "But since we agreed that food supplies would be handed over every 6 months, you must honor the deal. You're a man, after all, you can't go back on your word." Oxhead nodded vigorously, thinking to himself, as expected of a wandering hero, even his jokes are so amusing. Listen to that, a man, how inspiring. And so young too. Wait, young? Oxhead suddenly felt something was off. Becoming a wandering hero isn't as simple as wearing a cloak and carrying a longsword. While one could act chivalrously without such items, that would make them a knight or a great hero, but not a wandering hero. The defining trait of a wandering hero is belonging to a unified guild. Organization. Each member enjoys roaming freely. Moreover, to become a wandering hero, one must pass an examination. This examination tests martial skills and physical prowess. One thing is certain, without reaching the foundational level, one cannot pass the test. According to what Oxhead knew, the youngest wandering hero in legend was someone who passed the exam at the age of 20, successfully earning the wandering hero badge. Moreover, this happened many years ago and had become a tale of lore. If someone younger had passed the exam, surely he would have heard such groundbreaking news. The young man standing before him looked no older than 17 or 18. In other words, he couldn't possibly be a wandering hero. With this realization, Oxhead suddenly shrugged off John Rivers' hand. His previously hunched posture straightened in an instant, and the grin on his face vanished into thin air, replaced by a fierce, menacing expression of defiance. "Who are you to impersonate a wandering hero and try to intimidate?" Mid-sentence, Oxhead realized that saying it outright would be embarrassing. Thinking quickly, he changed his words, "To deceive me." John Rivers disliked his quick-wittedness. On the contrary, he felt annoyed by the action of having his hand brushed aside. Whether it was a sudden nerve snapping or being too drunk to recognize the disparity in strength between them, after a moment of daze and hearing Oxhead's question, John Rivers' first reaction was to swing his hand and deliver a slap. A crisp slap echoed. Oxhead's mouth fell open, a clear handprint appearing on his face. The group of underlings behind him could no longer endure such humiliation. A bandit, short and somewhat skinny, but with a temperament opposite to his stature, leaped forward, shouting loudly, and raised his blade, aiming to strike John Rivers directly on the head. When it comes to striking ruthlessly or ambushing, the most crucial aspect is minimizing unnecessary actions. Clearly, this bandit lacked the ability to play tricks. He should have quietly delivered a stab instead of yelling out his intent and raising his blade high, exposing his vulnerability. This failed tactic led to an unfortunate outcome. Before he could bring the blade down, perhaps while he was still roaring, believing himself to be imposing, John Rivers' second slap landed. Perhaps due to differences in physique, weight, and skill compared to Oxhead, while Oxhead remained stunned in place after the first slap, the short bandit spun around from the force of the second slap and collapsed onto the ground. Whether or not I'm a wandering hero has nothing to do with you. What's so great about being a wandering hero? Just a few days ago, I killed one. Anyone not afraid of death, step forward, and I'll show you what I'm made of. John Rivers shouted after striking them. He wasn't wrong. At this moment, his identity no longer mattered. What mattered were the two slaps he had delivered, which landed on the right targets. Humans are indeed peculiar creatures, no matter the world, they behave the same. Once overwhelmed by sheer dominance, even the boldest of individuals can turn cowardly, and even experts can become hesitant. Let alone a group of second-rate bandits. Oxhead completely surrendered. Because he simply couldn't figure out the background of the young man in front of him, someone who could remain unfazed in the presence of dozens of burly men and even boldly slap one of them. Such a person was definitely not ordinary, either a hidden expert or someone with a powerful background. Despite racking his brain and considering countless possibilities, Oxhead would never have imagined that this young man was merely acting recklessly under the influence of alcohol. Without saying another word, Oxhead, dejected, led his dozens of equally dispirited brothers to leave quickly. Under the sunset, their galloping figures on horseback appeared desolate and sorrowful. At this moment, John Rivers let out a drunken burp, mumbled a few curses, and then, with his legs turning weak, collapsed into Thomas Miller's arms. "Mr. Miller, this wine is too strong. I'm drunk." These were John Rivers' last words, before falling into a deep sleep. Thomas Miller and the villagers exchanged glances, remaining silent for a long while. Finally, the old village chief, who had the most composure, instructed everyone to return to their homes. Thomas Miller and Zhao Kuei carried John Rivers back. "This kid is stirring up trouble. That group of Oxhead's men won't let this slide," the village chief said with a bitter smile. Thomas Miller naturally understood, but having endured enough humiliation from those bandits, the village elders had several times considered risking their lives to confront them. However, looking at their wives, children, and elders, they ultimately chose to endure. Despite having the advantage in numbers, they were always exploited by the bandits. After offering a few words of comfort to the village chief, Thomas Miller, feeling unsettled, accompanied Zhao Kuei to take John Rivers home. The next day, when John Rivers opened his eyes, he only felt slightly tired. There was no pounding headache or chaotic aftermath as he had imagined after drinking. It seemed that having a healthy body was not only a foundation for revolution, but also a foundation for drinking. Thomas Miller and Margaret Miller were not at home. Only Emily Miller was at the door, playfully twisting a willow branch she had found somewhere into strangely shaped wreaths. Seeing John Rivers awake, Emily Miller skipped over to him, her ever-present bright smile making her small face look incredibly endearing. John Rivers greatly admired this innocent smile, because he knew he could never smile like that again. Things that are lost or things that cannot be had truly make people cherish and reminisce about them even more. The sun's already shining on your back, and you're still not up. I've never seen anyone as lazy as you. Emily Miller teased John Rivers with a mischievous grin, sticking out her tongue as she stood by the bed. John Rivers pretended to strike her, but Emily Miller quickly darted away, leaving behind a trail of clear, cheerful laughter. "Where have your parents gone?" John Rivers asked while stretching his back. Emily Miller peeked half of her face out from the doorframe. "Both of them went to the open field. It seems all the adults in the village had to go, They said it was to discuss yesterday's events. Emily Miller's clear response caused John Rivers to piece together fragments of his memory. After thinking for a while, he finally recalled everything that happened yesterday, what he had done and the potential consequences. Although he didn't feel fear, a faint sense of shame rose in his heart. If he hadn't intervened so recklessly and caused such a commotion, perhaps the villagers could have resolved the situation peacefully by offering a small amount of food. But now, things had escalated. While the bandits had temporarily retreated, there was an overwhelming chance they would return for revenge after reconsidering. This was a disaster John Rivers had brought upon them. Therefore, he decided that, no matter what, he should take responsibility for it. The open field next to the village, near the lake, was barren without a single weed. It was a gathering spot for the villagers during festivals, but otherwise served no purpose except as a playground for children. When John Rivers led Emily Miller to the open field, he saw the villagers gathered in a noisy, chaotic scene, talking animatedly among themselves. As soon as they noticed John Rivers approaching, they greeted him warmly. Although this young man had done some unconventional things, he was generally friendly with everyone, so no one held grudges against him. Moreover, many villagers secretly applauded the 2 slaps John Rivers had delivered. After being oppressed for so long, even the most good-natured people would feel anger. While they were too afraid to openly oppose the bandits, John Rivers' actions had at least provided some satisfaction. John Rivers nodded and smiled as he made his way into the crowd. He immediately spotted the village elder and Thomas Miller standing in the center, along with a few other elders, all with grim expressions on their faces. "Oh, the young master is awake," Thomas Miller joked. "If you want to drink, wait a bit. We're discussing something important right now. Your injuries have just healed, you should rest for now." John Rivers' injuries had long since healed, but Thomas Miller said this only as a polite way to dismiss him, not wanting him to get involved in the matter. However, John Rivers clearly ignored Thomas Miller's words. He plopped himself down on the ground, making it clear he wasn't going anywhere. "You didn't mind the dirt," and plopped down on the ground. Emily Miller, though still young, was a girl after all and naturally couldn't be as careless as you. Instead, she cleverly and obediently sat on John Rivers' lap. It was a good spot, clean and comfortable. "You should leave as soon as possible," the old village chief said to John Rivers. "The Oxhead gang won't let this go easily. If you leave, they might not give us too much trouble. After all, we've dealt with them many times before, and they might still show this old man some respect." As soon as the old village chief finished speaking, a few young men standing nearby couldn't hold back and wanted to speak up. However, despite the chief's aging body, his sharp eyes remained as piercing as ever. With just one glance, the young men fell silent. It was clearly a lie, and John Rivers could tell. But on the other hand, he also understood that the old chief was asking him to leave for his own good, not wanting him to face unnecessary danger. However, if John Rivers left, the wrath of the bandits would undoubtedly fall upon the villagers. He truly didn't believe in the so-called respect the old chief mentioned. Causing trouble and then running away, leaving innocent villagers to bear the consequences of ruthless bandits who wouldn't hesitate to kill, this was not the way of a true hero. Although John Rivers didn't consider himself a hero, he couldn't bring himself to let others suffer for his actions. #### Chapter 18, Carrying the Sword and Courage. Before John Rivers arrived, the villagers had been discussing for a long time. Although they were collectively deliberating on how to handle the inevitable retaliation from the Oxhead gang, 2 completely opposing opinions emerged. The first opinion was that the bandits were merely after some money and supplies. As long as their demands were not excessive, it would be best to give them what they wanted, apologize, compensate, and ensure they couldn't find John Rivers. This way, the matter could be settled peacefully. Those who supported this idea were mostly the elderly, led by the village chief. The second opinion, however, was entirely different, brimming with strength and fiery determination. The younger villagers, led by Zhao Kuei, believed that after years of extortion by the bandits, even though handing over supplies didn't leave them starving, living under constant oppression was intolerable. They preferred to fight the bandits. Even if they couldn't completely eliminate the gang, at the very least, they could make them think twice before targeting Brickhead Village again. A few timid women suggested reporting the matter to the authorities, but their proposal was immediately dismissed and ridiculed by the men. In the past, when the villagers had attempted to report the bandits, the authorities had proven incapable of dealing with dozens of outlaws hiding deep in the mountains. At the slightest hint of trouble, the bandits would vanish without a trace. The county constables had made a show of conducting raids a few times, but they hadn't caught so much as a hair of the bandits. The outlaws were also said to be highly skilled at bribing officials. This led to collusion between the authorities and the bandits. As a result, the bandits grew bolder, the officials' private coffers grew fuller, and the suffering and survival of the common people clearly weren't of concern to either side. Thus, reporting to the authorities was futile. The villagers were left with only two choices: continue living in humiliation or fight to the death. Both sides stood firm in their positions, arguing loudly. Thomas Miller frowned but remained silent. He truly didn't know what to say. In his opinion, from the very first time the bandits extorted them, they should have fought back, letting those scoundrels know what it meant to bite off more than they could chew. As a result, back then, most people chose to endure. Even the village chief, Thomas Miller, couldn't say much about it, leading to today's situation where the bandits grew even more arrogant, completely disregarding the villagers. The young men from the neighboring villages combined were definitely no fewer than 500, yet they were being bullied by less than 100 bandits. This injustice was something Thomas Miller couldn't swallow. However, the village elders believed that since the other villages followed the custom of offering tribute, Brickhead Village shouldn't be the first to rebel. Their homes and fields couldn't afford to provoke such ruthless thugs. No one dared to take the lead, so everyone could only act like foolish geese waiting to be slaughtered. The group led by Oxhead thrived on the offerings from these villages, casually engaging in opportunistic trades, living a carefree life. But after John Rivers struck Oxhead yesterday, the courage of the village's young men could no longer be suppressed by the elders. Everyone declared they wouldn't tolerate the oppression anymore, fervently rallying for a fight. Thomas Miller had once longed to see the villagers show such resolve and bravery, but now he thought more about the aftermath of a confrontation. How many scenes of parents mourning their children would there be? How many widows would be left behind? Thomas Miller himself might not fear death, but he dreaded leaving his wife and children behind without anyone to care for them. If they fought the bandits, even if they won, casualties were inevitable, that much was certain. Unable to make a decision, Thomas Miller remained silent. The crowd began arguing again, each voicing their own opinion. At that moment, they heard another voice ring out. "Emily Miller, do you think their constant arguing will scare the bandits to death?" John Rivers asked. Emily Miller smiled and shook her head, saying no. "Then, Big Brother, can you go find someone to help deal with those bandits?" Emily Miller immediately clapped her hands and said yes. The villagers also thought this was a great idea, so everyone fell silent, looking at John Rivers with hopeful expressions. The village meeting had failed to reach a consensus, but John Rivers' timely suggestion was clearly a relatively feasible solution. If successful, everyone would be rid of the bandit threat; even if it failed, the consequences would fall on someone else first. And so, everyone dispersed, placing their hopes on John Rivers. At Thomas Miller's house, John Rivers had no luggage to pack, so he strapped the wanderer's sword onto his back. Thomas Miller kindly handed him the deceased wanderer's money pouch. However, as for the dead man's wanderer badge, John Rivers had no interest in wearing it. Besides, the name on the badge didn't sound appealing at all. The village chief was also present and appeared a bit uneasy about John Rivers' proposal. In truth, Thomas Miller himself wasn't entirely confident, but given the current situation, he could only hope that John Rivers truly had the skills he claimed. To be fair, this young man didn't look like an ordinary commoner. Perhaps he really had a solid background to rely on. John Rivers remained calm and composed, inquired about the bandits' hideout, and took a simple map that Thomas Miller had drawn for him before heading out. Golden A, upon seeing John Rivers' attire, immediately knew that its work was about to begin again. Although it was reluctant to leave the comfort and ease of this place, as a mount with noble lineage, obedience to its master was second nature. Without hesitation, it allowed the saddle to be placed on its back and patiently let John Rivers lead it out of the yard. Thomas Miller and the village chief couldn't help but give a few words of advice, while Emily Miller showed no concern at all. Instead, she urged John Rivers to return quickly, mentioning that the kite had been slightly torn these past few days and was still waiting for him to fix it. John Rivers readily agreed, not realizing at that moment that this departure would last much longer than he expected, so long, in fact, that he would never again have the chance to see the kite he had made soar into the sky. With a gentle nudge to the horse's belly, Golden A, who hadn't moved much in a while, broke into a trot. Before long, the figures of those bidding farewell had disappeared into the distance. Truly not an ordinary person, the village chief remarked with a sigh, watching the trail of dust fade away. Thomas Miller remained silent, while Emily Miller held the kite with a melancholic expression. Above, a flock of geese flew past, their cries inexplicably carrying a faint note of sorrow. Household matters were something he understood well. John Rivers, of course, had neither a family guard nor any close friends he could summon at a moment's notice. Although, if he were to head to Heavenly Capital City and visit the astrological tower to find Victor Sage, there was an 80 to 90% chance he would receive assistance. However, the round trip alone would take at least a month. Even if he could wait, the mountain bandits surely wouldn't have that kind of patience. John Rivers didn't want to return only to find himself attending the villagers' funerals. Moreover, the memory of Victor Sage berating him as useless still lingered in his mind. To seek help from the royal advisor for something as trivial as dealing with a group of petty bandits would surely be blowing things out of proportion. At that point, who knows how Victor Sage would mock him? Thus, John Rivers resolved not to willingly put himself in such a humiliating position. He had already thought this through. Since this was a situation he had caused, and he had boldly declared his intention to act as a righteous hero, it was only natural for him to take on the challenge alone and charge into the lion's den. This decision wasn't made impulsively. On the contrary, he had considered it quite rationally, ensuring he had a good chance of success in dealing with the mountain bandits. Since they were minor bandits, naturally, they wouldn't have any martial arts masters of exceptional skill. Even Oxhead, their leader, was merely a brute. Based on his strength, which was equivalent to that of an entry-stage martial artist like himself, dealing with them wouldn't be overly difficult. Of course, if he had already reached the entry stage, taking action would be even easier, perhaps as effortless as slicing through vegetables. During his recovery period in Brickhead Village, John Rivers hadn't been idle. He meditated and practiced breathing techniques daily. Naturally, he also diligently trained in his life-saving skill, the stone buoyed finger. Even so, while he could sense his inner energy growing, and though the stone buoyed finger hadn't yet reached the point where it could unleash power from a distance, its force seemed to have increased. Still, John Rivers knew he was far from achieving the entry stage. He didn't know exactly what it would feel like to reach such a level, but as Ethan Stone had once told him, when you reach it, you'll naturally know you've arrived. These words are very cryptic, much like a Zen riddle. Thus, John Rivers interpreted it himself: when one's cultivation no longer progresses slowly but suddenly increases exponentially, that is the proof of a breakthrough. Unfortunately, up to now, John Rivers still hasn't witnessed such proof. He felt a bit thrilled but not afraid. Even John Rivers himself couldn't understand why, after coming to this world, not only had his physique changed, but even his courage had grown. With a sword in hand and a reason he couldn't refuse, John Rivers boldly carried these two weapons and, following the map, headed straight to Oxhead's lair. As the sunset descended, the crimson sun gradually disappeared behind the vast mountain ranges, while Oxhead was in a thunderous rage. The grilled meat wasn't tender enough, the wine lacked flavor, and even the subordinates' beards were too unsightly. Essentially, anything could become a reason for Oxhead's fury. In truth, his subordinates all understood, and even Oxhead himself was well aware, that the real cause of his anger stemmed entirely from the humiliation he had endured at Brickhead Village the day before. If it were Oxhead from a few years ago, after being slapped in the face, he would have immediately drawn his blade without hesitation. But after interacting with the authorities, Oxhead had come to understand a principle: true power wasn't in the steel blade in his hand or the brothers at his back, it was in authority and influence. On the surface, they robbed and killed, committing countless crimes, but compared to the high-ranking officials dressed in pristine robes, they were nothing more than small fry before sharks. With just a flick of a finger from those officials, he could be left with no place to bury his body. Thus, Oxhead gradually became more cautious. Knowing who he couldn't afford to offend, Oxhead constantly reminded himself to think things through carefully and avoid provoking those he shouldn't. In his eyes, John Rivers was exactly the kind of person he couldn't afford to provoke. First of all, during their initial meeting, John Rivers carried a duelist's sword. According to the rules of the Duelist Guild, anyone who wasn't a duelist but was caught carrying an official duelist sword would face punishment from the guild. This punishment not only involved confiscating the unauthorized sword but often came with additional physical penalties. For example, cutting off a hand or breaking a leg. No one dares to underestimate the power of the Dewheap Guild, so very few people dare to disregard their rules. However, rules must also consider relationships. Prominent noble families with good connections to the Dewheap Guild can occasionally forget the rules. And be forgiven. ##### Chapter 19, Kill Carefully. That day, in everyone's eyes, John Rivers appeared majestic and imposing, very much resembling a noble from an aristocratic family. John Rivers was tall and could be considered handsome. Although his skin was slightly tanned, Oxhead immediately recognized that this young man had likely never endured hardships or faced adversity. Of course, Oxhead didn't know that John Rivers had been lying in a coffin for over a decade. Even if he had wanted to experience hardships, he wouldn't have had the chance. As for adversity, John Rivers had only recently begun wandering alone, and the only suffering he had encountered was a near-fatal sword wound, though, unfortunately, Oxhead couldn't see the scar from that wound. Thus, Oxhead assumed that John Rivers came from a significant background. Despite feeling humiliated, he didn't dare to cause trouble on the spot. However, anger was inevitable afterward. After smashing a few plates and bowls in frustration, Oxhead began questioning his own masculinity. Had he become so accustomed to dealing with corrupt officials and focusing solely on money that he no longer cared about his pride? Seeing their leader brooding even after a night had passed, the gang of bandits also felt a burning sense of indignation. Dozens of brothers had been intimidated by a mere boy who hadn't even fully grown up yet. If they let this incident slide, how could they ever face the villagers again to demand taxes or collect grain? With these thoughts in mind, the drunken bandits urged Oxhead to take action. If they didn't behead that brat and add a few more graves to Brickhead Village, they'd have no face left to live in this region. Oxhead thought it over and realized they had a point. If word of this humiliation spread, the surrounding villagers would surely look down on them. And for those who were despised, no one would offer tribute anymore. At that point, not only would they fail to extort anything, but the young men from the neighboring villages might band together and wipe them out entirely. So, Oxhead decided to follow the will of heaven and his brother's advice. That night, they would drink and feast to their heart's content, and the next day, they would gather their forces to teach the people of Brickhead Village a lesson and kill the boy in black. When this decision was announced, the bandits felt exhilarated. They immediately lit a bonfire, noisily raised large cups of wine, and feasted on meat, eagerly awaiting the bloodshed to come the next day. If these gleeful bandits had known that while they lit their fire to drive away the darkness, John Rivers was already climbing the mountain, they would have regretted using the flames as a beacon for him. While they plotted to take lives, someone else had already made their move. John Rivers quietly hid in the tree, even he hadn't expected things to go so smoothly. Using the map, John Rivers located the mountain occupied by Oxhead and his gang. He cautiously climbed the mountain alone but did not tie Goldeneye to a tree. The reason for this was twofold. First, Goldeneye wasn't the kind of foolish animal that would run around aimlessly. Second, in case something unexpected happened to him, Goldeneye could still find its own way to survive. As he carefully made his way up the mountain, John Rivers tried to observe everything around him and listen in all directions. He knew the bandits would guard their hideout vigilantly, with sentries posted day and night. However, as he ascended the mountain, even when he spotted the campfire and heard the laughter and chatter of the bandits, he found no sentries and not even a single simple trap. It could only be said that John Rivers was fortunate. Though they were just a small group of bandits, Oxhead understood the importance of caution. Normally, there would always be a few men patrolling and standing guard. But today was different. With the planned bloodbath of Brickhead Village set for tomorrow, Oxhead decided to mobilize all his forces. Since everyone was going, tonight's feast served as a farewell banquet, and naturally, everyone was required to attend. Even the few lackeys assigned to guard duty eagerly joined in, raising their cups in celebration. After several rounds of drinking and trips to relieve themselves, the idea of standing guard had long been forgotten. The men gathered to eat, drink, talk about beautiful women, and tease one another. It was a scene of utter relaxation, comfort, and joy. The bandits grew increasingly boisterous and even more carefree. But their joy had nothing to do with others, such as John Rivers, who currently had no reason to be cheerful. In autumn, while mosquitoes were fewer, they hadn't completely vanished, especially in the forests on the mountains. John Rivers had no idea how many bites he had on his body, nor could he count how many types of insects were crawling all over him. What annoyed him even more was that his stomach had started growling loudly, demanding food. Particularly when he saw someone in front of him eating to their heart's content, his hunger intensified, as if every cell in his body was screaming for food, demanding to be fed. John Rivers felt a bit regretful. He shouldn't have pretended to be so carefree, galloping off on horseback. He should have brought some dry rations with him. Now, he could only curl up on a tree, enduring the torment of hunger and insect bites, hoping that this group of scoundrels would hurry up, finish eating, and go to sleep. Charging up the mountain alone on horseback to unleash a massacre, leaving the sun and moon dimmed and the sky stained with blood, while it sounded impressive and mighty, that wasn't John Rivers' plan. After all, he didn't have the ability to pull it off. With his current abilities, if he were to directly challenge this group of bandits, the only outcome would be being hacked to pieces, dying without a burial place. Therefore, his strategy was to wait for the dead of night, when the bandits were deep in slumber, before making his move. From a certain perspective, there's not much difference between someone deeply asleep and someone dead. Naturally, killing the dead is far easier. John Rivers endured immense suffering for a long time, but fortunately, he persevered. The drunken bandits, eyes hazy and unfocused, began to scatter and retire for the night. Even the sentries weren't much more alert than their companions, each grabbing a random blanket, wrapping it around themselves, and collapsing under some tree, sleeping as if they were dead. It must be said, though this lot was too drunk to fulfill their guard duties properly, at least they slept right at their posts, somewhat diligent in their own way. The diligent may succeed first, but tonight, the diligent will die first. John Rivers carefully climbed down from the tree and headed straight for the sentries. Without expending much effort, he ended their lives. It's said that during one's first kill, the body might react unpleasantly, trembling, vomiting, for instance. But John Rivers seemed unaffected. When he killed the vagabond earlier, he didn't feel nauseous at the sight of blood, and now, even after eliminating several bandits in one go, he still felt nothing. Perhaps after changing bodies, even his nerves had become much more desensitized. That's the only explanation John Rivers could accept, as he didn't want to think of himself as cold-blooded and unfeeling. In reality, though, John Rivers felt no emotional attachment to the vast majority of people in this world. To him, they were like characters in a video game, able to speak and move, but ultimately meaningless. Lacking a sense of belonging and empathy for this world, John Rivers killed without hesitation. After dealing with the guards who were fundamentally incapable of raising an alarm, John Rivers began approaching the bandits' camp. The so-called camp was merely a perimeter of wooden stakes as thick as a child's arm. Inside were about a dozen large and small houses. The simple gate, even if locked, posed no challenge for John Rivers, who easily slipped through the gaps. The campfire within the camp was still burning, and the sound of snoring had already begun to harmonize, putting John Rivers further at ease. Earlier, while perched in a tree, he had observed the camp. Aside from Oxhead and a few leaders who had private rooms, the rest of the bandits were crammed into two very large wooden houses. Each house likely held around 30 people. Judging by the external dimensions of the wooden structures, it was clear that such cramped conditions would not be particularly comfortable. John Rivers silently slipped into one of the large wooden houses. As soon as he entered, he was nearly overwhelmed by the stench inside. He couldn't help but admire the adaptability of these bandits. To sleep soundly with their mouths open in such a foul-smelling atmosphere was truly a testament to their incredible endurance. Inside the house, there was only one large bed, upon which 30 or so burly men lay sound asleep. Suppressing the urge to cover his nose, John Rivers slowly approached, raised his duelist's longsword, and without hesitation, plunged it downward. Someone once said that if you want a person to die instantly, attacking the heart isn't the best method. The precise target should be their glabella. A person with a pierced heart still has a few seconds to react, but once the glabella is destroyed, death is immediate and absolute. John Rivers didn't have the time or inclination to locate the glabella of each bandit. To him, targeting the glabella was essentially attacking the brain's central nervous system. If that was the case, any angle of penetration into the brain would likely yield the same result. Practical experience confirmed this to be true. 30-odd corpses, now forever silent, bore witness to John Rivers' hypothesis. Wiping the sweat from his brow, John Rivers quickly left the house. He needed fresh air to cleanse his lungs from the torment they had endured. Taking deep, gasping breaths, the night breeze blew against John Rivers, offering sweet relief. He had never imagined himself capable of killing so many people in a single night. But as he withdrew his longsword from the final man's head, John Rivers thought to himself that he might kill even more in the future. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that he was still alive. As for how many he killed, perhaps someone might care, but John Rivers certainly didn't. After clearing out one large house, John Rivers used the same method to send the unfortunate occupants of the other large wooden house into eternal slumber. By this point, he was beginning to feel a bit fatigued. It wasn't physical exhaustion, but the mental strain of trying to avoid waking others, minimizing noise, and yet exerting enough force to kill. It was truly taxing. More importantly, he was starving. The smell of blood did nothing to dampen John Rivers' appetite. At this moment, he felt like he could devour an entire cow. As it stood, aside from the gang leader Oxhead, there were only 3 subordinates left alive in the mountain camp, a total of 4 people. Even if they discovered him and charged together, they likely wouldn't pose much of a threat. With this thought, John Rivers felt there was no real danger, so he continued searching for food. Finding food was easy. Beside the campfire lay leftover roasted meat from the bandits. Though it was somewhat repulsive, John Rivers frowned slightly but ate his fill, washing it down with a large gulp of wine. Instantly, he felt reinvigorated. He raised the longsword in his hand, its blade mottled with bloodstains. His current state was just right, so he decided to eliminate the remaining targets immediately. #### Chapter 20, A Visitor from Afar. John Rivers finished eating and prepared to continue his killing spree. Just as he took a step forward, his body instinctively sensed a surge of danger. The moment, goosebumps rose on the flesh. Beneath his ribs, John Rivers pushed off with both legs, suddenly lunging forward. He rolled once on the ground and sprang to his feet, holding his longsword horizontally across his chest. Due to the forceful push-off earlier, 2 shallow footprints were left on the ground. Not far from these footprints, a black arrow was lodged into the earth. Even the feathers of the arrow were black, clearly designed for use in the darkness of night. John Rivers had no idea where the attack had come from, but he could confirm one thing: the person who fired the arrow was definitely not Oxhead or any of his surviving comrades. Moreover, this arrow was truly eerie. John Rivers hadn't heard the sound of it cutting through the air. If not for his body's special ability to sense danger, that arrow would have pierced through him by now. Tense, but cautiously observing his surroundings, John Rivers tried to stay calm, keeping his body ready to react instantly to any threat. Both hands gripped his sword tightly, prepared to unleash a powerful strike at a moment's notice. "Who's there?" "Show yourself," John Rivers said in a low voice. At this point, he was even more reluctant to wake Oxhead and the others. No one responded. Even the wind seemed to grow quieter, as though it had become timid in the presence of some unseen force. It is often said that people fear not the strongest enemy, but the invisible one. Right now, John Rivers couldn't agree more with that sentiment. Apart from the black arrow on the ground radiating an intense killing intent, John Rivers had no clue where his opponent was. This was the most dangerous part. Initially, he thought he was the only hunter tonight. Unexpectedly, it seemed someone else was also out for blood. Worse yet, it now appeared that the target of this other hunter was him. John Rivers slowly turned in a circle, still unable to find any trace of his enemy. Therefore, he decided to move a bit away from the campfire. Indeed, every house has its own light. Staying near the fire not only blinded him to anything in the darkness, but also made him a very obvious target. Stepping lightly with his right foot, John Rivers was now moving sideways, like a crab. This method allowed him to remain more alert while ensuring his body movements weren't too exaggerated. However, for an archer, the size of the movement doesn't matter. As long as there's motion, there will be an opening, and the deadly arrow will be released. The moment John Rivers' right foot was about to touch the ground, a black arrow appeared. It was as if the endless darkness had birthed this eerie black arrow. Silent and nearly undetectable, at least to John Rivers, who could only rely on his eyes to track its trajectory. For an average person, what the eyes see often doesn't allow the body to react in time. But this clearly didn't apply to John Rivers. With both hands gripping his sword, he slashed down forcefully. A sharp clang echoed, and John Rivers felt a slight numbness in his hands. His heart sank. That damned archer is using pure iron arrows. Although he knew the situation was unfavorable, John Rivers didn't hesitate. He believed that if he managed to block this arrow, and if this arrow momentarily halted his movements, the archer in the darkness wouldn't miss the chance to launch a continuous attack. Sure enough, just as he struck the black arrow to the ground, another arrow emerged from the darkness, aiming straight for his face. He had heard tales of martial arts masters bravely biting arrows with their teeth, but John Rivers had no intention of trying such a feat. First of all, his martial arts skills weren't that advanced. While he was courageous, he had no desire to break his teeth. Thus, his only option was to evade, and once he dodged, he couldn't afford to stop. Lowering his head, hunching his back, rolling to one side, pushing off with his left foot to spring back up, these were the rapid, fluid movements he executed. This sequence of actions allowed John Rivers to take cover behind a nearby house. When performing these movements, he didn't know what he was dodging, only feeling that the marksman wouldn't miss the chance to kill him in one shot. So, after slashing the first arrow and dodging the second, he instinctively executed a series of evasive maneuvers. Looking at the black arrows embedded in the ground not far away, John Rivers silently admired his own judgment. When he used his sword to slash the black arrow, he had already deduced the marksman's position. More importantly, he immediately thought of a blind spot the marksman couldn't attack. Thus, despite everything, he rolled clumsily but quickly took cover behind a house. To be precise, it was in front of the house. The marksman was outside the wooden fence of the mountain camp, and John Rivers crouched in front of a house door, panting heavily. His heart was racing, but his breathing wasn't overly labored. The dangerous situation earlier had nearly cost him his life, but for now, he was still alive. As long as he was alive, there was still a chance. The key was to figure out how to counterattack. Just then, as John Rivers was hiding outside the door, he suddenly heard a creaking sound. The door opened. Inside this house lived a leader of mountain bandits. Having drunk too much wine, he hadn't slept for long before the urge to urinate woke him up. In a hurry to relieve himself, he opened the door to his room and immediately spotted a man holding a sword, crouching stealthily outside. It's worth noting that, apart from Oxhead, this bandit leader feared no one on the mountain. Seeing someone blocking the path outside his house, and clearly, this person didn't look like Oxhead, the leader shouted angrily, "You bastard!" He had intended to yell, "You bastard, I'm not up to anything indecent here. What are you eavesdropping on that's so amusing?" But before he could finish his sentence, the man's sword had already pierced through his lower abdomen, running him through. The leader's mouth gaped open as his clothes were instantly soaked in blood. At least, it seemed that before his death, he managed to accomplish what he had woken up to do, urinate. As he relieved himself one final time, the bandit leader mustered all his remaining strength to let out his last sound in this world. It was a blood-curdling scream. It wasn't that John Rivers intentionally stabbed the opponent's bladder, it was because he was in a squatting position, and the situation happened so suddenly. Unexpectedly, someone opened the door and came out. His first instinct was to thrust his sword. There was no time to consider that this strike wouldn't be fatal immediately, giving the victim a chance to scream in agony. However, what was done was done. John Rivers quickly moved on to his next action. He abruptly stood up, grabbed the leader who was still barely alive, twisted his neck with force, and threw him outside. The longsword was withdrawn in the process. The leader, with the sword removed from his body and violently flung to the ground, was clearly on his last breath, unable to survive. Next, John Rivers did something even more remarkable. He turned back into the leader's room, jumped onto the bed, sat cross-legged, and began to channel his energy, restoring his body to its peak condition. Outside the mountain camp, archers were lying in ambush. The dying scream of the leader had undoubtedly alerted Oxhead and the other two remaining leaders, but John Rivers remained unfazed. He made no preparations whatsoever and instead went into the room and got on the bed. This wasn't something an ordinary person would think of, but it was the correct course of action. By hiding inside the room, the archers naturally couldn't locate their target. Meanwhile, Oxhead and the others, awakened and rushing out to investigate, would only find a corpse on the ground along with a few black arrows. Based on the scene, they could only deduce that the enemy must have at least one archer. The subsequent reasoning would seem even more logical, since arrows were used instead of swords. It was clear there was no direct confrontation, meaning the attacker must be hiding at a distance. That was enough. John Rivers wanted Oxhead and the others to think this way. Once they believed it, they wouldn't suspect that the culprit was hiding in the victim's room. In truth, John Rivers might have overthought it. With the intelligence level of Oxhead and his men, such complexity wasn't necessary. Awakened by the scream, Oxhead immediately jumped out of bed without even putting on clothes. Bare-chested and barefoot, wielding a blade, he rushed outside. The two remaining leaders, though slower to emerge than Oxhead, also charged out with weapons in hand. Perhaps it was fate's cruel joke, but after years of Oxhead leading his brothers through countless battles, tonight marked the moment when they finally achieved uniformity in their appearance and equipment, bare-chested, wearing only shorts, barefoot, and wielding steel blades. The three men, resembling triplets, stared intently at the corpse lying on the ground, seemingly unable to process what was happening for a moment. After about 10 seconds of bewildered glances at one another, Oxhead was the first to react. "Why are you just standing there? Get them up. Or are we just waiting to collect bodies?" The two leaders panicked and shouted loudly, but the bandits in the large wooden house seemed to have turned into obedient children tonight. Once they fell asleep, waking them up was no easy task. Sensing something was wrong, the two leaders rushed into the large wooden house, only to retreat outside with pale faces. They didn't need to say anything, Oxhead already understood. The three of them had been shouting for so long, yet their brothers showed no reaction. There was only one explanation for this: they were no longer capable of reacting. The dead, of course, do not respond. Oxhead's eyes turned bloodshot, living up to his nickname. At that moment, he truly resembled a raging mad bull. If you've got the guts, come out here. Hiding in the shadows doesn't make you a hero. I'm right here waiting for you. Oxhead roared. It wasn't because he was particularly brave, he wasn't the kind of man who would risk his life recklessly. The reason he shouted like that was because he knew that since the opponent had acted so ruthlessly, sparing not a single brother in the mountain stronghold, there was no way he, the leader, would be allowed to survive. If he was going to die anyway, he might as well die with some flair, even if no one was there to witness it. The other two subleaders also realized that today was likely the day they would meet their end. Initially terrified to the point of their courage shattering, they now felt less fear and gripped their steel blades tightly, standing alongside Oxhead and shouting insults loudly. John Rivers sat motionless inside the house, thinking to himself that with Oxhead and the others provoking like this, the archer was more than likely to strike. It seemed inevitable that Oxhead and his men would fall to a deadly arrow. For now, he decided to sit back and enjoy the show. He imagined things would play out as expected. Little did he know, the show would indeed unfold, but he would end up being the main character. I'm in the room of this dead man. If anyone wants to die, feel free to try me. A lazy voice echoed, and John Rivers' heart sank. This death-seeking provocation was, of course, not something he had shouted. But that no longer mattered. What mattered was that Oxhead and his men had now turned their attention to him. Chapter 21, A Fateful Night of Murder. No matter how deaf one might be, they could clearly hear that the shout did not come from inside the house. But it didn't matter, because Oxhead and his two subordinates didn't care who shouted, they immediately assumed someone was hiding inside the house. Even though they believed it, even though they were seething with rage, the three of them still didn't dare to charge in recklessly with their blades. They merely stood blocking the door, hurling curses and shouting obscene words, yet not taking a single step forward. John Rivers thought for a moment before stepping out with his sword. As soon as he appeared, Oxhead and his men instinctively retreated a few steps, but they still maintained a crescent-shaped formation, their steel blades pointed directly at John Rivers. So it's you. Oxhead growled through gritted teeth, his bloodshot eyes glaring. He hadn't expected that his intent to loot some money and provisions would end up offending such a ruthless killer. Most of the brothers who had followed him for years were likely already dead at the hands of this young man. Oxhead deeply regretted it. If he had planned to seek revenge, he should have anticipated that the other party might eliminate all threats. How infuriating it was that dozens of strong men in the mountain stronghold, drunk and careless, had been wiped out silently. Despite being a bandit who killed and plundered, Oxhead had always prided himself on being a manly figure, standing tall and unyielding. As the saying goes, licking blood off the blade is a common affair, living a life of boldness in the mountains and forests. But tonight, the overwhelming stench of blood filled his nostrils. Faced with a mysterious and absolutely ruthless master of combat, Oxhead suddenly realized he wasn't as fearless as he had always imagined. In truth, he was terrified. His so-called rage stemmed partly from the loss of wealth and partly from his desperate attempt to suppress his fear. But the trembling blade betrayed him, not just him, but also his two brothers, who were so terrified they were utterly disoriented. Though they dared to shout curses at the killer's ancestors, the moment the murderer truly appeared before them, they didn't dare utter another word and immediately charged forward to attack. John Rivers stood at the doorway, his long sword held horizontally across his chest, his gaze openly provocative. He didn't want to leave the shelter of the house. Who knew when that damned black arrow might shoot out again? Facing three opponents, while also dodging hidden arrows, was no easy task, and John Rivers wasn't entirely confident. Who exactly are you? Why are you on a killing spree? Do we have some kind of grudge against you? Oxhead, being the leader, still had the presence of mind to ask. The reason for asking was simple: Oxhead hoped today's matter could end here. Although nearly all his brothers had been killed, if John Rivers was willing to stop and leave, he wouldn't stop him. After all, while the lives of his brothers were important, they were ultimately not as precious as his own. John Rivers hesitated. His purpose in coming here was to kill all these bandits, and it seemed his plan was nearly complete. If it came to a fight, the three of them, including Oxhead, weren't worth his concern. The only thing that gave him pause was the person hiding in the shadows. Judging from the iron arrows embedded deeply in the ground, the other party clearly bore no goodwill. John Rivers furrowed his brow, conflicted and silent. The reaction of the man clearly embarrassed Oxhead, and John Rivers' contemplative demeanor led Oxhead to misunderstand. No need for chatter, just get to action. With things having reached this point, there was no other choice. Oxhead and his two subordinates exchanged glances, gritted their teeth, and the three of them simultaneously let out a loud shout, raising their blades as they charged at John Rivers. If you want our lives, then even if I die, I'll make sure to bite back. Even if I'm no match for you, at the very least, I'll make you bleed. With such thoughts in mind, Oxhead and his two companions charged forward without hesitation. At this moment, they truly resembled fearless men, casting aside the trembling fear that had gripped them. If they couldn't take the opponent's life, then they would gamble with their own. There was no other path left to take. The three of them, having fought alongside each other for years, displayed some level of coordination. Their three blades simultaneously targeted John Rivers' upper, middle, and lower body. Using the house as a shield was no longer an option. In this situation, if he were forced back into the house, the narrow confines would undoubtedly put him at a disadvantage. After all, he was facing three opponents, and his longsword, being longer than their blades, would be even harder to wield effectively. Reluctantly, John Rivers had to sidestep and move quickly into the yard, focusing his full attention on dealing with the situation. He remained cautious of those strange black arrows. Otherwise, he would have already taken the opportunity to counterattack with his sword while dodging. But suddenly, the surroundings became eerily quiet. No one spoke, and no iron arrows came whistling through the air. The first slash from Oxhead and his two companions was merely a test. Seeing John Rivers standing in the open yard, without speaking or exchanging glances, the three quickly positioned themselves in a triangle formation, encircling John Rivers in the center. At this moment, John Rivers realized something was amiss. Most of his attention had been focused on guarding against potential snipers in the shadows. Unexpectedly, in a brief lapse of concentration, he found himself surrounded by three people. Back in his school days, John Rivers had often been involved in group fights. The energy of high school students was usually abundant, and occasional sparring matches were quite common. During those times, John Rivers learned an important lesson: if you're alone while the opponents are two or more, the best strategy is to back yourself against a wall or a tree. Essentially, you must block off your escape route. This wasn't about emulating Han Xian's famous tactic of fighting with no retreat. While it carried some risks, it also helped reduce the angles from which opponents could attack. At the very least, every move the opponents made would be within his line of sight, eliminating the fear of being ambushed from behind. Unfortunately, the lesson he had mastered over a decade ago was completely forgotten tonight. The three surrounded him, and at most, his eyes could focus on two of them. This left the third person free to exploit any opening and strike. John Rivers finally began to feel a bit tense. He couldn't help but lament inwardly that if his combat skills were sharper and his level of mastery higher, he wouldn't have to worry about being encircled like this. Despite being surrounded, John Rivers remained motionless, holding his sword horizontally without saying a word. To Oxhead and his companions, this conveyed a completely different impression. Oxhead assumed that John Rivers' indifference to being surrounded stemmed from absolute confidence in his own abilities, making him unconcerned about how the fight would unfold. Not only did Oxhead think this way, but his two brothers shared the same belief. John Rivers held the sword, his eyes unmoving, his body still. His demeanor exuded an air of profound mystery. Though his martial prowess might not be exceptional, his stance alone was enough to intimidate. After a brief standoff, the three men led by Oxhead finally made their move. Each strike of their blades aimed directly at vital points, showing no mercy. Mercy was out of the question. This young man had slaughtered all their comrades. John Rivers refrained from striking first, intending to counterattack with precision. He believed his speed and strength far surpassed these bandits. Even if he acted second, he was confident in seizing the upper hand. Most importantly, John Rivers was convinced that their limited skills would lead them to repeat the same techniques without variation. Thus, he patiently awaited their first move. While this approach carried some risk, John Rivers had no other choice. He was unwilling to waste time entangling with these three scoundrels, especially since, hidden in the shadows, another enemy had already drawn a bow and aimed at him. Three blades split their attacks, one slashed at his neck, another aimed to cleave his head, and the last swept horizontally at his waist. As the glint of the blades flashed, John Rivers sprang into action. Lowering his stance slightly, he suddenly lunged forward, directly confronting the bandit leader who sought to split his head in two. The leader froze for a moment, then grinned with delight, eager to channel all his strength into cleaving apart this fool who had delivered himself to death. His plan wasn't bad, but unfortunately, his mind could only calculate to this extent. The blade of the Wanderer's sword was exceptionally long. Aside from the hilt, which could be gripped with both hands, the blade extended over 3 meters. At this moment, the lengthy blade had pierced through more than half of the leader's body. His eyes held a hint of confusion. The leader didn't have time to wonder why his opponent's sword was so fast or why the man had ignored the attacks of the other two, focusing solely on taking his life. It wasn't that John Rivers disregarded the attacks from the other two. After careful consideration, he had chosen this method of assault. By killing one enemy first, he no longer needed to worry about the other's attacks. A blade aimed for his neck missed by just an inch above his head, while Oxhead, who had intended to slash John Rivers across the waist, could only watch helplessly as his weapon failed to even graze the edge of his opponent's clothing. As expected, dealing with such inexperienced bandits was laughably easy. A faint smile appeared on John Rivers' face. Without pausing, as the lifeless body slid off his sword, John Rivers charged toward the remaining leader. Oxhead was horrified but utterly powerless. He could only lift his blade once more in a desperate attempt to slash at John Rivers' back, though even he didn't believe he would land the strike. And indeed, he did not. The last surviving leader had already thrown aside his weapon. Clutching his bleeding throat with both hands, his eyes widened in terror, but not a single word escaped his lips. John Rivers calmly wiped the blood droplets from his sword. Raising his left hand, he gave a slight wave. "It's your turn." Oxhead gripped his blade tightly with both hands, but he no longer had the courage to attack. Cold sweat was trickling down his forehead. Perhaps because he was bare-chested and barefoot, he suddenly felt very cold, and this chill seemed to seep deep into his bones. "A lot of people have died today." Oxhead gritted his teeth. "Whether you want to show off your power or seek revenge for the villagers, going this far is more than enough." John Rivers said nothing, merely smiling as he looked at him. Desperate to survive, Oxhead spoke again. "If you want money, gold, or treasures from the vault, you can take whatever you like. I won't stop you." John Rivers still didn't speak, only gazing at Oxhead with an increasingly amused expression. "What do you want in the end? Do you really have to hunt me down to the very last?" Oxhead was on the verge of losing his mind. Seeing Oxhead's anger, John Rivers slowly lowered his sword. At this motion, Oxhead couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. It seemed like they could still negotiate. But the words John Rivers spoke next plunged him into utter despair. ##### Chapter 22, Entry Stage. "Cutting grass at the root, this phrase sounds a bit too ruthless," John Rivers said. Oxhead thought the situation might take a turn, and a glimmer of hope for survival appeared in his eyes. "Of course, I'm not a heartless person. Look at me, I don't even seem like a cold-blooded killer, John Rivers continued, and the hope in Oxhead's heart grew stronger. Then John Rivers smiled, a smile tinged with mockery. But you must die, because if you don't, I'll feel uneasy, very unhappy. Slowly stroking the blade of his sword, John Rivers spoke in a tone as light as the breeze. Oxhead's heart sank to the depths. To him, John Rivers' mocking smile was no different from the face of a devil. Even the most cowardly will struggle and resist when faced with death, let alone someone like Oxhead. So, he began to fight desperately. But soon, his body lost its life and collapsed to the ground, his eyes still carrying a trace of unwillingness and a hint of rage. Killing someone truly wasn't difficult. For the current John Rivers, dealing with someone like Oxhead was far too easy, so easy that he found it boring. With a casual flick of his sword to shake off the blood, John Rivers suddenly felt a chill, his body momentarily stiffening. However, the white-clad figure before him was evidently far more formidable than the unlucky wanderer from before. Furthermore, even if he somehow managed to survive this time after being gravely injured and defeating his opponent, it was unlikely that Thomas Miller could rush to save him again. If death comes, so be it, after all, he had already died once. The white-clad figure seemed to notice John Rivers' tension, and a faint smile appeared on his haggard face. How about this? If you can withstand one arrow from me and survive, I won't kill you. What do you say? The white-clad figure's proposition was extremely arrogant. The truth was, he could indeed easily kill John Rivers. John Rivers himself was fully aware of this fact. Thus, he could only reply, all right, regardless of whether the opponent would keep his word or not. At the very least, it gave him a sliver of hope. The moment John Rivers uttered the word all right, before his lips could even close, the white-clad figure's black arrow had already been loosed. Like a venomous snake, it shot straight for the space between John Rivers' brows with chilling precision. The arrow's release was sudden, but fortunately, John Rivers had remained vigilant the entire time. He hadn't let his guard down, even when the opponent appeared to offer leniency. This allowed him to react instantly. The speed of the black arrow was so overwhelming that John Rivers wasn't sure he could dodge it. Moreover, he had no intention of evading. Holding his sword before his chest, he decided to try blocking it head-on. The long sword struck fiercely at the arrow. Based on his judgment, this single strike should send the black arrow plunging into the ground. After all, he had previously managed to cut down a similar black arrow. However, the same type of arrow, fired by the same person, didn't necessarily carry the same force. This was a detail John Rivers had clearly overlooked. When the longsword struck the black arrow, the arrow not only didn't fall to the ground but instead ricocheted off the blade, emitting a sharp, piercing sound from the collision as it continued to shoot toward John Rivers. His hands numb, John Rivers could only watch helplessly as his sword strike failed, leaving him with no time to swing again to block the arrow. Without thinking, in a moment of crisis, John Rivers reached out with his left hand to grab at the black arrow. This action seemed somewhat like closing the barn door after the horse has bolted. By logic, given the speed of the black arrow and John Rivers' reaction time, his attempt to catch it should have missed. Yet at the instant the black arrow rebounded off the longsword, John Rivers suddenly experienced an inexplicable sensation. The surrounding darkness faded from his awareness, the enemy before him disappeared from his focus, and even the longsword in his hand was forgotten. He saw only the black iron arrow flying toward him. Under his gaze, the black arrow seemed to pause for a fleeting moment, allowing his left hand to grasp its tail in time. Moreover, it was thought that even wielding the sword with both hands wouldn't have been enough to deflect the black arrow. If such strength couldn't stop it, then a single left hand's effort should have been utterly futile. But John Rivers truly caught the black arrow. Just as the arrow was less than an inch from his head, it was halted, because his hand firmly gripped its tail. His hand was steady and resolute, while the black arrow, now akin to a venomous snake caught by its throat, lost all its lethal force. The man in white seemed slightly surprised, his previously half-closed eyes opened a bit wider. Entry stage already? Kid, your luck is truly remarkable. John Rivers paid no attention to the other person's words, nor could he. At the moment, he felt as though he were inside a furnace, not only being burned like a moth to a flame but also unbearably uncomfortable. It seemed as if a fire within his body was about to erupt, yearning to merge with the external flames and incinerate his body to ashes. He grew somewhat panicked. Although he tried to forcibly channel his internal energy into his meridians, the energy within him suddenly seemed endless. No matter how much effort he exerted, it surged chaotically, threatening to explode his body. Why not let your luck improve a bit? The man in white appeared slightly reluctant but still raised the longbow in his hand, stepped closer, and placed one end of the bow against John Rivers' dantian. A light breeze, carrying a faint chill, gently entered John Rivers' body. Though it seemed small and insignificant, the breeze gradually swirled, forming a tiny vortex. The violent internal energy within John Rivers' body seemed unable to resist the pull of the small vortex and rushed toward it, spinning as it gathered. The more it accumulated, the faster it spun until, in the end, it completely swallowed the gentle breeze that had entered his body. The man in white widened his eyes, appearing to have discovered something incredible and incomprehensible. However, he quickly shook his head with a smile, withdrew the longbow, and stood there with narrowed eyes, observing John Rivers. Compared to the earlier pain and panic, John Rivers now felt immensely comfortable. It was as if he were lying on a cloud made of cotton candy, floating in bliss. The internal energy in his dantian continued to rotate, and with each rotation, it felt as though a sweet dew was cleansing his meridians. The sensation was slightly ticklish, but also carried an indescribable pleasure. In short, John Rivers now resembled a dog closing its eyes while its chin was being scratched, thoroughly enjoying the moment. The man in white displayed an unusual patience, standing with arms crossed and a slight tilt of his head. The current scene, viewed from afar, resembled a nobleman taking a deep drag from an opium pipe, closing his eyes in intoxication under the moonlight, while his white-clad attendant stood respectfully beside him, gazing with admiration. John Rivers didn't stay intoxicated for too long, it only felt like an eternity to him. When he opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was naturally the white-robed figure staring intently at him. Without much thought, John Rivers understood clearly that, had it not been for this white-clad man's intervention earlier, he himself might have ended up in a terribly embarrassing situation, or worse, his body could have truly exploded, leading to his death. Although this white-robed gentleman had previously appeared intent on taking his life, the fact remained that the man had saved him. Thus, John Rivers decided to express his gratitude. But he quickly realized that his gratitude might not be necessary. "There's no need to thank me," the white-clad man said with a sly smile, his expression resembling that of a fox eyeing a helpless chick. Chapter 23, The Allies of Black Arrow, Part 1. Facing the smile of the man in white, John Rivers released his grip on the black arrow and forced a smile in return. "At first, I truly wanted to kill you because you're not a wanderer, yet you carry the wanderer's sword and go around killing people. For that alone, even if you were to die by my hand, it wouldn't be unjust," the man in white explained. "These wanderers and their absurd rules, just carrying a sword, could be serious enough to cost someone their life?" John Rivers smiled, silently cursing in his heart. The man in white looked at him with amusement. "This sword has clearly been used for a long time. If it's in your hands now, then there's an 80 to 90% chance its original owner is already dead, isn't that right?" John Rivers sank into thought. Rumor had it that these wanderers were united in their cause. No wonder this man wanted to take his life, turns out it was to avenge one of his own. "Don't overthink it. I couldn't care less about which unlucky wanderer you killed," the man in white said, seeing through John Rivers' thoughts. Feeling slightly uneasy, John Rivers asked, "Then, since I've taken your strike, as per our agreement, can I leave now?" The man in white nodded. John Rivers let out a sigh of relief. "If that's the case, then farewell. Next time we meet, I'll treat you to a drink." Shaking his head with a smile, the man in white leisurely replied, "You're indeed free to leave. However, you'll have to leave with me." John Rivers grew agitated. Don't tell me a master like you would go back on his word? First of all, I'm not going back on my word. You are indeed free to leave, the man in white said calmly. But I never said you could leave on your own. John Rivers was momentarily speechless. Wasn't this essentially kidnapping? The man in white patted John Rivers' shoulder in a friendly manner. You're a smart person. You should know that coming with me is at least temporarily safe. If you refuse my goodwill, the outcome might be unpredictable. This was clearly a threat. However, it seemed John Rivers had no other choice but to comply. He couldn't defeat the man, and for now, going along with his arrangements seemed like the wisest option. So, he stayed silent. The man in white appeared quite pleased. Talking to intelligent people truly saved effort. Do you plan to shoot an arrow at my back? The man in white suddenly asked. John Rivers forced a bitter smile and shook his head. Though he had just reached the entry stage's initial level, attempting to ambush the seemingly carefree man in white was clearly out of the question. In that case, why not return the arrow in your hand to me so we can proceed? Tilting his head slightly, the man in white extended his hand. John Rivers obediently handed over the black arrow. The man in white then picked up several steel-tipped arrows scattered on the ground, placed them into his quiver, slung his longbow over his back, and led the way. Like a well-behaved child, John Rivers sheathed his longsword and followed suit. Even though John Rivers now felt his body brimming with strength after finally breaking through to the entry stage, he knew he had no choice but to comply with this man in white. The reasoning was simple: if the man wanted to kill him, he'd be dead for sure. John Rivers felt deeply frustrated. He had planned to play the hero, wipe out the bandits, and return to Brickhead Village to boast about his exploits. Who would have thought he'd run into someone so troublesome? Not only did he lose the chance to show off, but he also lost his freedom. Carrying a mix of dissatisfaction and doubt, he followed the man in white as they slowly descended the mountain. It seems the mood was quite good. The man in white led the way, humming an unnamed tune. His lazy voice sounded pleasant enough, and the melody exuded a carefree and relaxed vibe. The problem was, John Rivers, following closely behind him, couldn't find any peace of mind to appreciate it. This situation reminded John Rivers of a painting: a rogue, after achieving his goal, arrogantly and gleefully humming a vulgar song, while behind him was a helpless young maiden forced into submission, filled with sorrow and despair. And John Rivers, of course, was that helpless young maiden, complete with all the grievances. More than once, he tried to reach for the hilt of the sword on his back, intending to strike this man from behind with a ruthless move. But he never mustered the courage to do so. For some reason, the seemingly unguarded demeanor of the man in white made John Rivers deeply uneasy, as if he instinctively felt that even if he dared to ambush him, the one who would fall would not be the other party. This was a simple kind of intuition, and John Rivers trusted his instincts. "Sir, may I ask for your name?" John Rivers initially intended to say, "This honorable hero," but quickly reconsidered, thinking that addressing the person as brother might sound more amicable, fostering a sense of closeness, and perhaps even earning some goodwill. The brother he referred to did not turn around. "My appearance is my identity." "Why don't you take a guess?" the man replied. Sure enough, just putting on airs, acting like some big shot destined to get beaten up sooner or later, John Rivers cursed silently in his heart. Still, he decided to give it a try. Someone this skilled with a bow, putting on such a show, could he be called the Divine Archer? Or perhaps, the white-clad Divine Archer? Could it be that you're known on the martial arts scene as the Divine Archer? John Rivers asked. The man in white continued walking. A title like that, which easily stirs envy, is far beyond my capacity to bear. However, this martial arts world is indeed fascinating. You have quite the imagination. If I started talking about airplanes, computers, or nuclear bombs, then you'd really see what imagination is, John Rivers thought to himself. Then what should I call you? Old White. The man in white suddenly stopped, turning around and raising the blade of grass in his hand to strike. He didn't actually intend to hit, so John Rivers easily dodged. So, your imagination only goes that far? Wearing white means I should be called Old White. Then what should you be called? Little Black, the man in white retorted. Can't you come up with a name that doesn't sound like an animal? At this moment, John Rivers was dressed in an elegant black outfit, the very attire Ethan Stone had bought for him earlier, a pair of identical black suits. Unfortunately, this one had been pierced with a large hole by that damned wanderer. Thankfully, Margaret Miller, with her exquisite needlework, had mended it skillfully, making the tear barely noticeable. As for the other black suit, Ethan Stone had taken it with him. Since the bag of belongings had always been strapped to Ethan Stone's horse, when he left, naturally, the bag went with him. John Rivers couldn't help but sigh at having such a good master. Not only did Ethan Stone leave without sparing his disciple any travel money, but he also took his disciple's clothes. Not bothering to speculate further, John Rivers said, "My name is John Rivers. Now, you can just tell me your name directly so we can both save ourselves some trouble." The man in white continued walking forward. "You can call me Black Arrow. By the way, your name is really rustic." "No worries, I'll give you a better one later." The name Black Arrow was indeed straightforward and suited the man in white quite well. Yet, for some reason, John Rivers found himself reminded of a type of chewing gum. Of course, such a thing surely didn't exist in this world. No need to change my name. This one was given to me by my master. Ever heard of respecting your teacher and honoring their teachings? John Rivers had no way to escape, and fighting back seemed like courting death, so he resigned himself, plucking a leaf and putting it in his mouth. After puffing and blowing for a long time, he failed to produce even a single note. Black Arrow waved a blade of grass around, as if swatting away the night. "Your master doesn't seem like anyone particularly remarkable. Otherwise, why would they give you such a rustic name?" John Rivers felt a bit annoyed. If Ethan Stone wasn't considered remarkable, then there probably wasn't anyone in the world who could be. Still, it was better not to reveal too much about his master. Everyone needed to keep some secrets to themselves. "You don't know anything. The great Tao is profound, and profound represents a very high realm. And you, as a cultivator, don't even understand this?" John Rivers retorted sarcastically. Black Arrow immediately retorted, "Then can you show me the high level of mastery you claim to possess?" John Rivers was momentarily speechless. Having a good name, of course, is a positive thing, but it doesn't necessarily equate to possessing exceptional martial arts skills. Black Arrow also fell silent because they had reached the foot of the mountain, and the scene before him left him somewhat surprised. As a wandering knight of some status, Black Arrow's mount was a tall and sturdy steed, which he had named Little Black. This horse, with its jet-black coat as smooth as silk, a robust physique, and powerful limbs, could almost be considered a divine 1,000-mile horse. But at this moment, his proud steed exhibited none of its usual majestic demeanor. Instead, it appeared somewhat timid, its large head slightly bowed in a respectful manner. If it were a human, it would resemble a junior showing deference to an elder, not daring to breathe too loudly. Of course, there were no elders present here, neither for humans nor for horses. The creature standing before Little Black was simply another horse, smaller in stature, with a less impressive coat. By any measure, it couldn't compare to Little Black. Yet, the respect Little Black displayed was directed precisely at this golden horse, which at first glance seemed far inferior to itself. "You must have recognized that horse," Black Arrow remarked, watching the scene unfold with great interest. John Rivers, of course, recognized it, for it was his own horse, Golden A. However, John Rivers couldn't understand it. While Golden A might have a more distinctive personality than ordinary horses, how could it possibly command such respect from a noble and clearly superior steed like Little Black? Moreover, John Rivers was certain that Golden A was a stallion, and as a wandering swordsman, Black Arrow's steed would definitely not be a mare. Judging by the rugged appearance of that majestic horse, it didn't seem like a mare either. Could it be that Golden A even knows how to play at being a boys' love protagonist? John Rivers couldn't help but chuckle. This horse even managed to deal with a fellow of the same gender. It seems my horse is a bit stronger than yours, John Rivers said with a hint of pride. Though his martial arts were inferior to Black Arrow's, at least Golden could help him regain a bit of face. Black Arrow glanced at him. Though it's a bit peculiar, it's still a fine steed. What a shame, he didn't finish his sentence, merely shook his head at John Rivers and sighed before turning to walk toward his own horse. Though the words were left incomplete, John Rivers understood the implication. Black Arrow was saying that while the horse was excellent, its owner was lacking. If only I could defeat you in a fight, I'd teach you a lesson or two about respect right now. John Rivers could only play out a victorious scene in his mind. Seeing its master return, Little Black trotted over a few steps, its large face rubbing affectionately against Black Arrow, a loyal and endearing display of a fine steed. In comparison, when John Rivers returned, Golden merely glanced at him, snorted disdainfully, and continued leisurely chewing on the sweet, tender grass in its mouth. Comparing people to people can make one furious, comparing horses to horses can make one spit blood, John Rivers sighed. Hashtag Chapter 24, Black Arrow's Accomplice, Part 2. John Rivers had some doubts. That day, did the master really just casually buy 2 fine horses at the market? After all, Golden looked truly extraordinary. Black Arrow mounted his horse without a word, knowing that John Rivers would follow him. The reason was simple, although this kid didn't seem particularly sharp, he was undoubtedly smart. Not following him would certainly lead to consequences no intelligent person would want to face. The 2 horses galloped through the night. Black Arrow deliberately urged his horse to go faster. He wanted to see if the Golden horse was truly as exceptional as it seemed. Was it really stronger than his own Little Black? As expected, Golden couldn't outrun the galloping Little Black. However, from Golden's casual and disdainful glance, Black Arrow noticed that it wasn't trying its best to keep up. In other words, the reason Golden lagged behind Little Black wasn't due to poor physical ability, but simply because it didn't feel like overtaking. Black Arrow suddenly felt a pang of envy. Such an extraordinary horse, and yet it wasn't his mount. Compared to Black Arrow, John Rivers' horseback riding skills were truly inferior. Though he always wanted to gallop at full speed and enjoy the thrill of the wind rushing past, whenever Golden really sped up, John Rivers found the jolting motion unbearable. It seemed that those heroes galloping freely on screen, looking so composed, must have some secret technique to avoid the pain in their sensitive areas. Because now John Rivers understood, when riding fast on mountain roads, the best way was to shift your weight onto the stirrups rather than sitting firmly in the saddle. Otherwise, there'd be no need for castration, you could easily qualify as a eunuch just from the ride. The night wind howled, and John Rivers suddenly felt like a chivalrous hero, even though he didn't particularly welcome this feeling under the current circumstances. Brother Black Arrow, firstly, I am not a beautiful maiden, and secondly, I have no illustrious background. Even if you take me away, there's no benefit to be gained. So why do you insist on me following you? John Rivers decided it was better to ask directly. Keeping it bottled up inside was far from comfortable. Both on horseback, Black Arrow appeared far more imposing than he did. Perhaps it was due to his pure white attire, white robes, and a black horse, truly striking, truly majestic, truly dashing. You ruined my business. Helping me now is only fair, Black Arrow said, turning his head slightly. Honestly, if you explained things a bit more clearly, it wouldn't diminish your heroic demeanor at all, John Rivers replied with a hint of annoyance. Black Arrow smiled. At that moment, his lazy and relaxed demeanor made him seem nothing like a tyrant forcing someone to follow him. You don't want to come with me. Is there something more important you need to attend to? John Rivers struggled to control the reins. At the very least, I should return to Brickhead Village to let them know I'm safe. Leaving like this is hardly proper. The news of the mountain bandits being wiped out in a single night will spread quickly. The people of Brickhead Village will naturally hear about it, and they'll even credit the deed to you. Isn't that enough for you? Black Arrow said, yawning as if bored. Maybe it's just that living in Brickhead Village is more comfortable. If it were you, would you willingly let yourself be abducted without any clear reason? John Rivers retorted loudly. Although their time together had been brief, John Rivers felt that Black Arrow wasn't the kind of person who would draw his sword at the slightest provocation. Thus, his tone began to lose its earlier politeness. Perhaps annoyed by John's incessant chatter, or maybe just bored of their silent journey, Black Arrow decided it was time to entertain some questions. Ai kung beat, du heap la mot to chuk rong lan, kot song hoi duok moi nuoit song nan de quan ly. However, due to their vast numbers and differing personalities, some wanderers travel alone, while others gather in small or large groups to form wandering guilds. Black Arrow is a member of one such wandering guild. Moreover, the guild he belongs to possesses considerable strength. They typically search for treasures, explore, and uphold justice wherever they go. Even when accepting tasks posted by the guild association, they only take on missions of relatively high difficulty. Therefore, the task of eliminating the Oxhead bandits should have been beneath their notice. Furthermore, the old farmer who posted the bounty at the guild could only offer a little over 20 taels of silver. Such a task is so unappealing that even novice wanderers rarely take it. Dozens of lives for just over 20 taels of silver, it truly isn't worth it. Although wandering heroes often act under the banner of chivalry and righteousness, they are, after all, mere mortals, inevitably harboring some petty calculations. Moreover, as human nature has changed, pure-hearted and passionate wanderers of the past have nearly vanished. Therefore, the poor old farmer had little hope of finding someone willing to accept his request. However, luck seemed to favor him that day when he encountered the group led by Black Arrow. Black Arrow's wandering hero team consisted of 5 members. The leader was a man named Fierce Mountain, and aside from Black Arrow, the others were Shadowless, Little Fortune, and Wild Ox. This was a team with some reputation, having earned considerable renown under the leadership of Fierce Mountain. Unfortunately, as the saying goes, a pot doesn't crack at the well, but breaks on the road. In a recent mission, the mighty Wild Ox foolishly lost his life. This was a blow that the team found difficult to accept. Anger, pain, perhaps even a touch of helplessness, trapped by these emotions, the members of the wandering hero team turned to alcohol to drown their sorrows while paying tribute to their fallen comrade. At that moment, in the same tavern, there was another individual, the old farmer who had brought over 20 taels of silver to the Wandering Hero Guild to post a task. With goodwill and a desire to prevent this simple man from wasting his money, the guild staff had patiently and kindly persuaded the old farmer to leave, as such a reward was unlikely to attract any takers. Unable to fulfill the request entrusted to him by his neighbors, the old farmer, dejected, decided to drink away his sorrow. It was then that he happened to encounter Black Arrow and the others. The tavern was filled with all kinds of people, but when someone poorly dressed and visibly downcast sat drinking alone, it was inevitable that curious individuals would approach to strike up a conversation. Black Arrow was quite a gossip. Even in moments of sorrow, he still found the mood to meddle in others' affairs. After the old farmer dejectedly recounted the entire story, Black Arrow, already feeling frustrated, was eager to vent his anger. He immediately declared that he would take on the task and was willing to deal with those despicable bandits. The old farmer, of course, was overjoyed. Black Arrow, after drinking some wine, felt somewhat at ease. Sometimes, the bitterness in one's heart truly needed to be washed away with a bit of blood. Preferably, someone else's blood. The old farmer expressed his gratitude profusely, left behind some silver, and quickly departed. When Black Arrow took the silver to settle his bill, he realized that the 20-something taels were nowhere near enough to cover the cost of the wine. What infuriated Black Arrow even more was that he had impulsively taken on this task without the approval of the other members. Clearly, everyone else preferred to drown their grief in alcohol as a way of mourning their fallen comrade, rather than trekking far to kill a few insignificant bandits. Left with no choice, Black Arrow had to face the consequences of his drunken impulsiveness alone. When he arrived at the location, there were no bandits in sight, only a figure sneaking around the campfire, wielding a long sword. Uncertain of this person's identity, Black Arrow decided to investigate in his own way. His method, of course, was with arrows. A few arrows shot out, and Black Arrow quickly realized that the one holding the Wandering Hero sword was far from being a wandering hero because they hadn't even reached the basic level of mastery. Not a wandering hero, yet wielding the Wandering Hero sword? According to the guild's rules, such a person could be killed without issue. And so, Black Arrow's killing intent surged. At this moment, John Rivers spoke up, though opening his mouth wide in the windy night was hardly a wise choice. Rules? What rules? I think it's just because I stole your business deal, and now you want to take my life, John Rivers shouted, as if the volume of his voice could amplify the weight of his accusation. Black Arrow didn't even bother to turn his head. You're still alive right now, so stop spouting nonsense. Even though you've said so much, I still don't understand why you brought me here. John Rivers suddenly remembered that his purpose wasn't to listen to a story. Wild Bull was a strong martial artist. In the group, his main role was to support and cover the captain. Now that the big guy is gone, we're missing a martial artist who can coordinate with the captain, Black Arrow explained patiently. In the darkness, atop the galloping horse, John Rivers' jaw dropped in shock. You want me to risk my life alongside a bunch of strangers? Are you sure you haven't lost your mind? Black Arrow's voice remained calm and steady. Once you've been around us long enough, you'll naturally grow closer. Although your current level is quite low, with our guidance and some real combat experience, it'll greatly aid your development. Why did those words sound so condescending? John Rivers fumed silently. If it came to training, his master was 100 times better than these wandering mercenaries. Too bad the old man was unreliable, disappearing with a wave of his hand. Can I refuse? John Rivers asked cautiously. Black Arrow curtly replied, slit your own throat if you wish, I won't force you anymore. John Rivers, unwilling to take his own life, had no choice but to continue riding alongside Black Arrow on horseback. The two riders galloped through the night until dawn, only stopping to rest in a small town. If you're so eager to recruit me, shouldn't you at least ask for my opinion? Otherwise, even if we're reluctantly on the same boat, discord is inevitable, and that won't end well. After finishing breakfast, John Rivers initiated a serious conversation with Black Arrow. Black Arrow ate very slowly. By the time John Rivers had finished 2 bowls of porridge, Black Arrow's first bowl was still half full. As comrades, you will naturally work together with everyone, advancing and retreating as one, living and dying together. I have no doubt about that. Swallowing a mouthful of porridge with satisfaction, Black Arrow's gaze exuded a sense of ease. John Rivers raised an eyebrow. That's quite the exaggeration. You're not a worm in my stomach, you can't know my thoughts. In fact, if faced with danger, I might very well abandon all of you and escape on my own. That's just human nature, unrelated to morality or integrity, John Rivers added. Black Arrow set down his bowl and casually wiped his mouth with his sleeve. Trust me, you will undoubtedly become a worthy comrade because my name will forever shadow your path. Black Arrow smiled sincerely, and at that moment, a ray of sunlight illuminated his face. Hashtag Chapter 25, The Black Arrow's Ally, Part 3. John Rivers often found himself at a loss for words when facing Black Arrow. Though he wasn't bound hand and foot, being subdued by someone was still far from a pleasant experience. The only reason he didn't resist or fight back was that John Rivers believed joining a band of adventurers might actually be a good opportunity for self-improvement. Even though he didn't particularly enjoy the idea, he figured Ethan Stone and Victor Sage would likely be thrilled about him having a chance to grow through such an experience. In truth, Black Arrow was quite easy to talk to. Along the way, the two chatted about all sorts of topics, ranging from the mundane to the extraordinary. These conversations broadened John Rivers' understanding of the world and adventurers, giving him new insights. As a result, his resistance to being forced into the group gradually diminished. Today, after a long journey, the two finally arrived at their destination, Samwood City. The heavenly capital kingdom was vast, filled with numerous cities and towns. Samwood City was by no means the largest, most prosperous, or most magnificent of them all. However, this didn't diminish its significance. Within the city was an adventurers' guild, the only branch of its kind in the entire heavenly capital kingdom. It served as a gathering place for countless adventurers, making it undeniably important. John Rivers couldn't understand why the most powerful nation on the continent, with its expansive territory, only had a single adventurers' guild branch. Moreover, the main headquarters of the guild was located in the Virtuous Waters Kingdom, which also boasted 3 other branches, all situated in this commerce-driven nation. The Hundred Battles Kingdom also had just one Adventurers Guild branch, but that was more understandable. The people there were intensely martial. If the Heavenly Capital Kingdom was marked by its omnipresent military, and the Virtuous Waters Kingdom was defined by merchants at every corner, then the streets of the Hundred Battles Kingdom were often the stage for duels. No need for heated arguments. Just a single glance of dissatisfaction could lead to a duel. And given the temperament of the people of the Hundred Battles Kingdom, it's rare for anyone to back down from a challenge. The thirst and will to fight are deeply ingrained in their very blood and soul. As for John Rivers' question, Black Arrow couldn't provide an explanation either, but this matter really didn't require much thought. After all, the Adventurer Guild wasn't their own home, wherever it wanted to take root was its own business. The fortress of Tiangma City appeared ancient, with its weathered gates exuding a sense of history. However, the marketplace was as bustling as those in most other cities of the heavenly capital kingdom. Crowds moved back and forth, and occasionally, soldiers clad in iron armor and wielding longswords passed by. Apart from having a smaller population, fewer nobles, and less grand architecture, Tiangma City wasn't much different from the heavenly capital itself. Strolling through the streets wasn't John Rivers' favorite pastime, and Black Arrow obviously had no interest in loitering either. After entering the city, the two headed straight to a house in the western part of town. Though not a luxurious mansion, the house was spacious enough to accommodate a dozen or even 20 people comfortably. Black Arrow helped John Rivers dismount in front of the courtyard. The gate stood wide open, as if welcoming its owner back home. The yard was quiet, seemingly devoid of any occupants. Stepping into the courtyard, John Rivers glanced around. Much like Tiangmu, the large house bore the marks of age. It was old, but showed no signs of dilapidation. "It seems your friend isn't home," John Rivers said, looking at Black Arrow with a teasing expression. Black Arrow looked at him with the same gaze. "If no one is there, then who is the person behind you?" John Rivers thought Black Arrow was playing a joke on him. This kind of childish trick to fool someone was far too outdated. Yet, his body suddenly felt uneasy, a sensation eerily similar to having a blade pressed against his neck. John Rivers shuddered instinctively and turned his head to look back. His heart nearly stopped beating. Black Arrow hadn't lied to him. There really was someone behind him, and the distance between them was absolutely less than a meter. Seeing John Rivers so terrified that his hair stood on end, Black Arrow burst into laughter. Perhaps out of laziness, when he laughed loudly, his facial expression barely changed. His mouth seemed deliberately reluctant to open wide, making the entire laugh appear somewhat forced. The person standing behind John Rivers watched him jump in fright, their face devoid of emotion, before turning to Black Arrow. Although they didn't say anything, it was clear they were asking a question. "Let's talk inside. Put your dagger away. If you kill this kid, my trip here will have been for nothing," Black Arrow said cheerfully, casting a glance at the still-shaken John Rivers before heading into the house. John Rivers had truly been scared out of his wits just moments ago. The gate to the courtyard was wide open. Moreover, after entering the yard, John Rivers had carefully observed his surroundings and hadn't detected any sign of another person. Yet someone had silently appeared behind him. If Black Arrow hadn't spoken up, John Rivers would never have realized it, nor would he have suspected a thing. After receiving Black Arrow's response, the man in black, who had suddenly appeared, silently walked past John Rivers without sparing him another glance. Though Black Arrow had half-jokingly reminded the man in black not to act rashly, and though the man's hands were empty, holding no weapons, John Rivers was certain that, if needed, he could effortlessly produce a dagger from somewhere. He understood clearly that this was an extremely dangerous individual. Yet, this person exuded no killing intent. In fact, it seemed as though they emitted no aura at all. That was precisely why John Rivers hadn't sensed their presence when they appeared behind him. Looking at his strange and elusive movements, he truly lived up to the name of an assassin. Indeed, this was somewhat intriguing. John Rivers now felt a bit more eager to join this group. The Black Arrow's horse didn't need to be led into the stable, the intelligent steed wouldn't wander off. As for his own black horse, John Rivers was even more confident. Not because he thought it was like Black Arrow's horse, a divine steed of unparalleled quality, but because he believed that, with his black horse's inherently lazy nature, there was no chance it would run away. John Rivers followed Shadowless, his face devoid of emotion, into the main hall. There, he saw Black Arrow lounging on a chair, gulping down tea from a teapot. On the chair beside him sat a tall, broad-shouldered man with a square face and faint eyebrows that exuded a resolute aura. Next to this man was an exceptionally beautiful woman, lazily resting her hand on his shoulder while her eyes lingered on John Rivers. The man seated was Meng Shan, the leader of the adventurer group, and the woman beside him was, of course, Tiao Fu. When Black Arrow had first mentioned this name, John Rivers couldn't help but tease a little. A woman named Tiao Fu usually wouldn't be very attractive. But contrary to his expectations, Tiao Fu wasn't just beautiful, her figure was remarkably striking as well. If it weren't for Black Arrow mentioning that this woman was over 40, John Rivers might have entertained some fleeting, beautiful fantasies. Of course, it was merely a thought. John Rivers had no intention of pursuing her. Firstly, the age gap between them was quite significant. Secondly, she was the woman of Captain Meng Shan. "Young man, please have a seat." Meng Shan, though rugged in appearance, spoke in a gentle tone that naturally evoked goodwill. "I only knew you went to kill someone, but I didn't expect you'd bring back a living person. Who's this kid? The illegitimate son you've been searching for all these years?" Tiao Fu chuckled, her eyes curving into crescents as she laughed unabashedly, revealing her bright, white teeth. Ladies of noble upbringing, of course, would never laugh like that. They would either use a fan to cover their face or shield themselves with their sleeves, always maintaining an air of elegance, grace, and propriety. Tiao Fu, though a woman, was also a wandering warrior and naturally disregarded such formalities. This kind of straightforward personality suited her identity as a rogue. Her laughter showed no wrinkles at the corners of her eyes, making it hard to believe she was over 40. John Rivers silently marveled. Having once been terrified by Shadowless, John Rivers now remained composed. He slightly bowed in greeting before finding a chair to sit on, conveniently next to Black Arrow. Shadowless leaned against the doorframe, appearing as if she were an outsider. Her gaze was fixed on the blue sky outside, seemingly lost in the clouds or birds, her arms crossed and her face devoid of expression. John Rivers understood that when dealing with these wandering warriors, it was best to appear relaxed. The cumbersome rituals and formalities were not something these people appreciated. "Who speaks? You or me?" John Rivers reached out and snatched the teapot from Black Arrow's hand, gave it a shake, and seeing there was still quite a bit of tea left, tilted his head back and gulped it down in large swigs, mimicking Black Arrow's manner. Black Arrow brushed off droplets of water from his robe, seemed to ponder for a moment, then said, "Manhwa is gone." As he said this, for once, his expression turned serious. Meng Shan let out a soft sigh. "So what? The 5 of us have been together for over a decade." Black Arrow's voice grew heavy. "No matter what, Manhwa is no longer with us. While people like us have long become indifferent to life and death, this is still a blow." "And then?" Meng Shan seemed to prefer keeping things simple. this kid's potential isn't bad. Although he's currently just at the lower level of the entry stage, given some time, he could eventually take on responsibilities independently. So, I want him to fill Manhwa's position. Black Arrow finally revealed his thoughts. Mang Shan said nothing, and the hall grew quiet. John Rivers stopped drinking, placed the teapot on his knee, and lowered his head, tracing the patterns on it with his fingers, though his ears were clearly tuned in to their conversation. Manhwa is irreplaceable. Each of us is irreplaceable, said Tiao Fu, breaking the silence as Black Arrow fell quiet, seeing Mang Shan remain unresponsive. It's not about replacing him, Black Arrow explained. I just feel that. Mang Shan suddenly interrupted him, you think this young brother is quite good, so you hope he will join us. Black Arrow sighed, that's right. I really think so. I just feel that this kid isn't bad. What I said earlier about him replacing Manhwa's position was actually just an excuse. You can speak frankly, Mang Shan maintained his gentle tone. Black Arrow scratched his head, after all, Manhwa hasn't been gone for long. Suddenly bringing in a new person, I'm worried it might make everyone feel a bit uncomfortable. Little Luck sneered, since when did you become so thoughtful? If you don't want people to feel uncomfortable, why haven't you bothered to take a bath even once in the past few months? Black Arrow coughed awkwardly, clearly a bit embarrassed. Mang Shan smiled without saying a word and turned to face John Rivers. Younger brother, are you willing to join us? Chapter 26, Black Arrow's Comrade, Part 4. Mang Shan seemed to be asking for John Rivers' personal opinion. But for some reason, John Rivers felt that if he dared to utter even half a word of no, Black Arrow, sitting beside him, would have no hesitation in silencing him for good. With Mang Shan's polite and gentle demeanor playing the good guy, naturally, Black Arrow was ready to draw his blade and play the bad guy. Though John Rivers couldn't quite figure out where he was hiding the blade. A team, whether large or small, should always have these two types of people. Thank you all for your trust. John Rivers set the teapot down, putting on a serious expression. I'm just a reckless youngster, of course, I'm willing to have strong friends. I hope everyone will guide me more in the future. Black Arrow seemed very satisfied with John Rivers' response, and the others also appeared to have accepted this new recruit with ease. However, John Rivers felt that this was all a bit too easy. No one asked for his name, no one inquired about his background or history, and there were no solemn oaths or pledges. Just a few words, and he had already become a member of the roaming adventurer group. Moreover, he wasn't even an adventurer. Next, you should change your name, Black Arrow said with a hearty laugh. I already told you on the way here, if you use your real name, sooner or later, it'll lead to regret. Although John Rivers didn't quite understand why a man should not act without changing his name or sit without changing his surname, upon thinking it through, using an alias or nickname wasn't a big deal. If one day he needed to change his identity, it would be much more convenient. So, he didn't oppose Black Arrow's suggestion. The only issue was deciding on the name. Although he and Black Arrow had discussed this on the way, they still hadn't reached a conclusion. Mang Sun, Black Arrow, Shadowless, Little Blessing, these names were, of course, all nicknames. John Rivers believed there must be intriguing stories behind these individuals, but as a newcomer, he could only wait to learn them over time. As for the new little brother's nickname, everyone began to discuss it. Naturally, this everyone didn't include Shadowless, who was still staring blankly at the sky. The others had chosen their nicknames themselves. But since John Rivers was not only new, but also clearly inexperienced and much younger than everyone else, the seniors enthusiastically took it upon themselves to help him pick one. I have a suggestion, Little Blessing said with her naturally smiling eyes. To others, this woman truly seemed suited to always wear a smile, whether it matched her appearance or her demeanor. Since Wild Bull is no longer here, and Black Arrow brought you in as his replacement, why don't you call yourself Little Bull? Little Blessing was smiling as she spoke, but her tone didn't sound like she was joking. Compared to the names of the others, the name Little Ox was truly ordinary and rustic. He had never heard of any great hero possessing or favoring such a childish name. John Rivers felt like spitting a mouthful of blood at Little Blessing's face, letting her know just how dissatisfied and resentful he was with this name. What angered him even more was that the others seemed to agree with Little Blessing's suggestion. Shadowless didn't defend him, which was already disappointing, but John Rivers hadn't expected Fierce Mountain and Black Arrow to also wear expressions of amusement. Faced with John Rivers' firm refusal, everyone had no choice but to discuss the naming issue again. What John Rivers couldn't understand was, even if he was replacing Wild Ox, did the name absolutely have to be related to animals? Perhaps because she was the only woman in the team, Little Blessing ultimately decided on John Rivers' new name. From now on, his new name would be Sweet Dumpling, and she forbade anyone, including John Rivers himself, from having any objections. This domineering style was clearly long established. Fierce Mountain and Black Arrow nodded repeatedly, saying the name was excellent. This name has a slight phonetic resemblance to John Rivers. Of course, it's good, Little Blessing said, her smile growing brighter, her eyes curving into two adorable crescent moons. John Rivers remained indignant. While the new name successfully freed him from the animal category, and Sweet Dumpling was indeed quite endearing, what self-respecting man would want to use food as a name? If it wasn't going to sound majestic, it should at least be somewhat pleasant to the ear. In the end, John Rivers couldn't help but admit that the name sounded quite pleasant, and he willingly accepted it. After all, no matter how much he protested or objected, everyone had already started using the new name to address him. Even Shadowless, who was striking a pose nearby, turned to take a closer look at the new companion, seemingly trying to associate this person with Tang Yuan in his mind. It was a done deal. And so, with this ridiculous new name, John Rivers began his life as a wanderer. Since Samwood City housed the only adventurer guild in the Heavenly Capital Kingdom, it was naturally essential for adventurers of the kingdom to have a base here. Not only did Fierce Mountain own a private house in the city, but many other adventurers did as well. Numerous adventurer teams even chose this city as their headquarters. John Rivers learned that the group originally had a member named Bullman. According to Black Arrow's description, Bullman was a tall and muscular man, seemingly all brawn and no brain. However, Black Arrow never mentioned how Bullman had died. Moreover, John Rivers didn't see any grief on anyone's face, nor did he notice any mourning hull or the scent of incense. It was strange, considering that, according to them, Bullman had only recently passed away. Could it be that adventurers, constantly facing life and death, had become so desensitized, so cold and indifferent, that they eventually turned into someone like Shadowless, emotionless to the point of having no expressions at all? During a lively conversation, feeling a sense of camaraderie, John Rivers asked about this. If you all value brotherhood so much, why does it seem like no one has done anything to commemorate Bullman's death? This question was like a strip of tape, instantly sealing everyone's lips. Everyone, who had been chatting and laughing, suddenly fell silent. Of course, this did not include Shadowless, who remained in his usual posture, leaning against the door, stubbornly pretending to be part of the doorframe. Do you think we're being hypocritical? Outwardly, we seem to value emotions, but we won't even bother with the bare minimum of pretense, Tiaofu said, the smile on her face fading significantly. Yet, even when she was calm, people still felt like she was smiling. John Rivers sniffed. I'm curious. For instance, if a comrade who had fought alongside me for years were to die, I'd be deeply saddened. I'd build him a proper grave, set up a memorial tablet at home, and might even cry a few times. But you all look like nothing has happened, John Rivers finally remarked. You've never had a brother-in-arms who lived and fought with you for over a decade, nor have you experienced what we've been through, Mang Shan spoke up, retracting his smile. He still looked gentle, though. John Rivers tilted his head, processing Mason's words. What he means is that, while we are heartbroken, we no longer express it like ordinary people. But that doesn't mean we're cold-blooded. Sometimes, emotions can be expressed in many ways, Tiaofu kindly explained Mason's statement. John Rivers nodded. Still, I hope that if one day I kick the bucket, you all could remember me in a way I'd like. He Jian patted him on the shoulder. Don't worry. I'll place a bowl of rice dumplings on your tombstone. Meng Shan and Tiao Fu burst out laughing, while John Rivers glared at He Jian. Joking about someone's name was truly irritating, especially since he had been forced to accept that name. He's dead, but it's not over yet. Shadowless, who had been silent all along, suddenly spoke, startling John Rivers once again. He thought to himself that it was bad enough for an assassin to have ghostly movements and unpredictable actions, but even speaking so abruptly was unsettling. Tiao Fu sighed and leaned against Mason's shoulder, signaling, I'm tired, you explain what Shadowless meant. Although he was the team leader, Meng Shan was more than happy to follow the suggestions and opinions of his teammates, especially Tiao Fu's. During the mission, an incident occurred, which is why Manhwa died. Up until now, we haven't been able to retrieve his body. That's why Shadowless said it's not over yet, Meng Shan patiently explained. An incident during the mission? John Rivers' eyes darted around the four of them. He Jian had mentioned before that all five of them were at the upper ranks of entry stage strength. With such formidable power, an incident still occurred? Just who had they provoked? Now that you've joined us, it won't be long before we return. First, we'll give Manhwa a proper burial, and then we'll deal with the matter of revenge, Meng Shan said. John Rivers felt the need to organize his thoughts. So, you mean that as soon as I join, I have to risk my life? The serious and astonished expression on his face made Tiao Fu giggle. Mason, however, did not laugh. That place isn't necessarily dangerous. Last time, we were sabotaged. Otherwise, Manhwa wouldn't have died. The poison mist, controlled by the talisman, is truly difficult to deal with. Tiao Fu pouted. If we hadn't been caught off guard, Manhwa wouldn't have sacrificed himself to save everyone. Next time we meet, I'll make sure that scoundrel pays for it. Don't underestimate the enemy. If they dared to attack us, it's obviously because their strength far surpasses ours. If we're careless, we might lose someone again, Meng Shan gently reprimanded. Tiao Fu, fiddling with her sleeve, fell silent. But John Rivers suddenly caught a fleeting glint of malice in her eyes. It was a look mixed with hatred and cruelty. In that moment, John Rivers realized that the gentle and cheerful woman who often smiled was far from harmless. On the contrary, she might actually be quite terrifying. Since we'll be comrades from now on, sharing hardships together, I believe it's reasonable for you to tell me the full story about Manhwa, John Rivers said, placing down the empty teapot. Black Arrow looked at him. If you could replace the word demand, I think it would sound more reasonable. John Rivers was puzzled. Replace it with what? Of course, replace it with request. Speak more politely, and people will like you better. Do I really need to teach you such a simple principle? Black Arrow said, raising an eyebrow. You're truly asking for a beating, John Rivers replied after a moment of silence. Chapter 27, The Trap That Was Bought. Have you ever heard of the divine relics? Meng Shan asked. Tiao Fu, perhaps feeling a bit tired from standing too long, walked over to the door, sat down on the doorstep, rested her chin on her hands, and gazed at the sky alongside Shadowless. However, it was clear she lacked Shadowless's professional demeanor. Her eyes darted back and forth, far from the composed elegance of Shadowless, whose eyelids didn't even flicker. John Rivers seemed somewhat perplexed by Mason's question. He had heard of priests, temples, and even divine madness, but relics? That was entirely unfamiliar to him. There are many strange and mysterious places on this continent, Meng Shan said patiently. His calmness, almost feminine in its gentleness, felt fitting. John Rivers thought that with Mason's personality, he might never raise his voice in anger for his entire life. As if recalling something unpleasant, a hint of unease flashed in Mason's eyes. We received word from the guild. It was a rather challenging mission issued by the Adventurers Guild. Since we found out early and the difficulty was high, no one competed with us for it. That's good news, isn't it? More profit for you alone. Sounds like a decent haul, John Rivers remarked with a click of his tongue. Mang Shan gave a bitter smile. It should have been, but when we arrived, we discovered another team of adventurers had already entered the relics before us. John Rivers's eyes lit up. So, you acted first and used force to make them abandon the mission? Unfortunately, we didn't get the chance to act first. Looking back now, it's something we deeply regret. Black Arrow slumped into his chair with frustration. They truly regretted it, because the Minotaur had indeed died. That day, Mang Shan and the others spent a significant amount of money to obtain clues from the Adventurers Guild, specifically regarding the so-called Divine Ruins. If not mentioned, John Rivers truly wouldn't have known that the Adventurers Guild, aside from upholding the general principles of adventurers, also undertakes the tasks of accepting commissions and selling some valuable but uncertain information. Typically, those who take on tasks from the Adventurers Guild are not just adventurers, but also mercenaries. The latter group operates purely for profit, without adhering to the Adventurers' Code. In fact, some adventurers themselves are also mercenaries. Times have changed, and even traditions have evolved. In the past, mercenaries were likely a profession looked down upon by adventurers. When taking on tasks issued by the guild, one would naturally receive a reward from the client upon completion. However, teams like Masons often visited the guild to check for information rather than to earn money, they came to spend it. The reception desk at the Adventurers Guild in Samwood City always had a few individuals who seemed neither old nor young, half-dead in demeanor, speaking lazily and with a knack for dragging out their words. Usually, when others could say 10 words, these people would manage 5 at most, and even that was surprising. The guild hall was quite simple. On the main wall was a massive painted emblem of the adventurers, flanked by a few sets of tables and chairs. Behind each table sat someone, with large cabinets full of books and documents behind them. These individuals were the receptionists. Whether one wanted to issue a commission or purchase specific information, they had to deal with these people. Most of the other members in the group disliked the expressions and attitudes of these receptionists, so Mang Shan was usually the one tasked with interacting with them. Hearing what they said, John Rivers suddenly developed a strong interest in the Adventurers Guild. He thought to himself that he should give it a try, to see what was so peculiar about the test to become an adventurer. After reaching the entry stage, John Rivers became even more confident, which further fueled his curiosity and adventurous spirit. This was also why he went from being forced to join the adventurers group to willingly enjoying it. Don't worry, we'll soon take you for some training. The adventurer's exam shouldn't be a problem for you, and I'll even act as your guarantor, Mang Shan reassured him. John Rivers scratched his head. To become a wanderer, you not only have to take an exam, but also need a guarantor? What kind of guarantee? Black Arrow sneered at his ignorance. Do you think you can just walk into the guild and say you want to take the exam, and someone will immediately prepare it for you? The first step to becoming a wanderer isn't the exam, it's having a wanderer who's been in the guild for over 5 years sponsor and recommend you. Without that, you won't even get the chance to be tested. In that case, how did the first batch of wanderers join when the guild was established? Did they sponsor themselves? John Rivers asked a silly question. Black Arrow's mouth fell open, momentarily speechless. Are you stupid? This rule was made by those bastards after the guild was established. Do you understand what after means? John Rivers chuckled awkwardly, while the helpless sigh of Black Arrow echoed beside him. Let's get back to talking about the ruins of the gods and the Minotaur. Seeing Mang Shan also smiling nearby, John Rivers quickly reminded them. Mang Shan let out a small "oh" and began, the divine ruins on the continent have always been places many people long to discover. Over the years, a few ruins have indeed been found and looted clean, but no one knows who built such mysterious places. So, they can only be attributed to the gods. Wait. John Rivers raised his hand. So, you're saying there isn't just one divine ruin? Of course, there isn't just one, Black Arrow interjected. He seemed much more awake now, though he still looked a bit groggy. At least he carried a bit more energy. There are so many gods in this world. Even flowers and grass have their own divine protectors. If all of them left behind ruins, the number would be so vast that you wouldn't be able to explore them all in your lifetime. John Rivers rubbed his chin. As a steadfast atheist, he naturally did not believe in ghosts or deities. However, his sudden arrival in this world was difficult to explain scientifically. Moreover, during his past travels with Ethan Stone, his master had once mentioned that souls do exist. Although Ethan Stone didn't elaborate much at the time, John Rivers firmly believed that his master would never deceive him. If souls, in other words, are essentially ghosts, then if ghosts exist, it wouldn't be surprising for gods to exist as well. Initially, I planned to visit the guild to see if there were any places worth exploring. Unexpectedly, that reckless fool mentioned a lead about the divine ruins. Such a great opportunity, I certainly wouldn't let it slip by. I immediately purchased that information, Mang Shan said, his tone carrying a hint of nostalgia. Judging by his current expression, he was likely thinking that if he hadn't bought that information back then, perhaps Manhwa wouldn't have died. What kind of information was it? How much did you pay? John Rivers, ever curious about money-related matters, asked. It was a map. Mang Shan had purchased the map for a hefty sum of 10,000 silver coins. John Rivers clicked his tongue twice. That's one expensive map. Black Arrow snorted disdainfully, clearly looking down on someone inexperienced. The most annoying thing is that I asked the receptionist at that time whether we were the first ones to buy this map. Mang Shan gave a wry smile. He told the truth, as the map had just been delivered to Sam Mok City and hadn't yet been distributed to other guild branches. He lied? John Rivers asked. The receptionist wouldn't lie. Though they might look unremarkable or disheveled, as representatives of the Adventurers Guild, they take pride in upholding their words and actions with absolute integrity. He didn't lie, but he didn't tell the whole truth either, Mang Shan sighed. We were indeed the first to purchase this map, but it was originally sold to the guild by another adventurer team. John Rivers nodded. So, that group must have found clues about the divine relic and cunningly sold the map beforehand to make some money. By the time others arrived, there wouldn't even be scraps left. Truly clever. At that time, we didn't know the situation. To beat others to the relic, we departed at full speed toward the location marked on the map. Black Arrow propped his feet on the armrest of the chair, sitting in a rather disrespectful posture. Running in vain is one thing, Mason's expression turned grim, but they left a trap at the entrance when they departed the relic. If it were merely selling a useless map, it could be dismissed as a harmless prank among adventurers. However, knowingly setting up a trap infused with enchanted poison mist at the entrance, fully aware others would come, was clearly an intent to kill. It was evident that the adventurers who had obtained the map and entered the divine relic cared little about who might die as a result. But their actions blatantly violated the adventurers' code of conduct. Although Ethan Stone didn't explain much at the time, John Rivers believed that his master would never deceive him. Arriving at the Divine Realm relic in Mason, the group remained vigilant, maintaining their defensive formation as they cautiously approached the cave. It was an ordinary cave nestled amidst an endless range of towering mountains, part of the renowned 10,000 Great Mountains stretching thousands of miles across the continent. Although this area was marked on the map as part of the 100 Battles Kingdom's territory, the nation had neither the resources nor the interest to exploit the benefits of these mountains. Moreover, the mountains were teeming with venomous creatures and, according to rumors, even demons and spirits. Except for daring adventurers, hardly anyone dared to venture into the 10,000 Great Mountains. Even herbal gatherers who relied on the mountains for their livelihood only operated along the outskirts. The location marked on the map lay deep within the mountains, forcing Mason's group to venture further inside. Naturally, they had no fear of the snakes, beasts, or any other threats lurking within, let alone the outlandish legends. As a long-standing team of adventurers, Mason's group had a well-established formation, honed through experience and tailored to each member's strengths, ensuring maximum efficiency. Manhwa and Mang Shan led the way, followed by Tiafu, with Black Arrow behind them. As for Shadowless, he never stayed in a fixed position. Like someone incapable of sitting still, he moved around Tiafu and Black Arrow, yet never went ahead of Manhwa and Mang Shan nor strayed too far from Black Arrow. As an assassin, such behavior was perfectly natural. ### Chapter 28, Life and Death Without Suffering. Mang Shan is perhaps the most skilled martial artist in the group. While it's uncertain if that's the reason he became the leader, having a martial arts master to lead the team is undoubtedly a wise choice. Alongside him stands Manhwa, whose iron body and exceptional combat skills make him an invaluable ally. Tiafu follows behind them entirely due to her profession. She is a sorceress, also known as a cursed mage. It's hard to determine whether a mage or a sorcerer is stronger. Mages draw power from the heavens and earth, potentially wielding nearly limitless strength, something a sorcerer obviously cannot achieve. If someone had that innate talent, why would they choose to be a sorcerer? However, sorcerers have their own unique traits. Without the ability to draw energy from the heavens and earth, a mage becomes utterly powerless, whereas a sorcerer relies solely on their own strength without seeking help from any external source. Unraveling the laws of nature and forcibly seizing power, this is both an audacious and perilous path. Tiafu herself is an audacious and dangerous woman, despite her beautiful appearance and radiant smile. A sorcerer staying behind warriors ensures they are well protected while also allowing them to provide seamless support to their teammates. As an exceptional marksman, Black Arrow naturally takes the rear position to gain the time and distance needed for precise shots. A bow and arrow are, after all, long-range weapons. But this doesn't mean his effectiveness diminishes when enemies close in. Despite his name being Shadowless, he moves like a shadow beside Tiafu and Black Arrow, that's simply his style. Overall, this team is nearly perfect, excelling in both offense and defense. Approaching the cave entrance, Tiafu noticed nothing unusual, and Shadowless raised no alarms. Mang Shan and Manhwa trusted these two. If their sharp instincts detected no abnormalities, it was likely safe. The cave entrance was overgrown with weeds, among which a few seemed unusually long. Manhwa casually swung his sword, intending to cut down the obstructive plants. Almost simultaneously, two voices rang out. "Don't touch it!" Tiafu exclaimed, her eyes suddenly widening. "Step back!" Shadowless commanded. Although he lacked the sorcerer's ability to sense surrounding spiritual energy, the assassin's intuition made him feel as though the dark cave ahead had suddenly transformed into the gaping maw of a giant beast. Years of teamwork had made their coordination seamless. Without hesitation, everyone halted and retreated. Because this was the judgment of Tiafu and Shadowless, the group trusted them implicitly. Even before the words fully registered in their minds, their bodies instinctively obeyed. Manhwa also complied. However, just as he stopped, the blade of his sword had already grazed one of the weeds. It was a barely perceptible touch, so light that the blade left no mark on the grass. But death often comes unexpectedly, and even the smallest action can be enough for the Grim Reaper to achieve his goal. The cave entrance suddenly filled with a green mist, which at first glance seemed to spread very slowly. However, as Manhwa retreated while drawing his sword, he discovered that the blade had instantly turned green. But it wasn't the green of life, it was a color that evoked decay and rot. Manhwa desperately wanted to throw away the sword in his hand, but just as he realized something was wrong, his body lost all its strength. As he continued to retreat, he fell straight backward. It wasn't that Tiafu was careless or inattentive. This poisonous mist was clearly the work of a highly skilled sorcerer who used incantations to cast it. Before it took effect, not even a trace of danger or killing intent was detectable. There was no time to draw talismans or recite spells. In such a brief moment, Tiafu had no chance to react. Manhwa collapsed as if he had fallen into a deep sleep. Apart from a slightly pale green complexion, there were no other noticeable abnormalities. But everyone could feel it, the robust body of Manhwa no longer carried the breath of life. Even the soil around him seemed to lose its moisture, a testament to the potency of the poison. Mang Shan stared in shock at his fallen companion beside him. Though they were only a step apart, all he could do was watch helplessly, unable even to touch him. Tiafu's fingernails dug deeply into his palms, his eyes still filled with shock and disbelief. If it were just a single ambush and assassination, aside from the grief, perhaps everyone's anger wouldn't have been so intense. However, the moment Manhwa fell, Shadowless immediately sensed a faint trace of presence. Someone was lying in ambush nearby, maintaining a certain distance from everyone, yet still positioned to observe the situation near the cave. This person was highly skilled, and due to the distance, neither Tiafu nor Shadowless initially noticed anyone lurking. When Manhwa collapsed, the emotions of everyone present fluctuated strongly, even the person hiding in the shadows was no exception. Perhaps the only one who managed to maintain vigilance and composure was Shadowless. Although that trace of presence was extremely faint, Shadowless still accurately pinpointed the general direction of the individual. Shouting the name, Black Arrow, Shadowless darted out. He truly seemed to be flying because his feet didn't touch the ground, his whole body as light as paper, fluttering with the wind. Moreover, he moved incredibly fast. None of those present could match his speed, except for one thing. Black Arrow's steel arrows turned into a torrential rain, knocking, drawing, and firing in rapid succession. Black Arrow, who was always in a drowsy, dreamy state, now showed no signs of fatigue on his face. Within just a few breaths, he had shot all 50 arrows from one quiver, and 3 arrows from the second quiver were already knocked on his bow, though not yet released. Shadowless led the charge, soaring ahead, with Black Arrow closely following behind. Although Black Arrow's speed couldn't compare to Shadowless, he could execute the most effective suppression in the shortest time, at least ensuring that Shadowless wouldn't be hindered during his advance. Zhang Bao sprinted forward, his movements of drawing and shooting arrows appearing rigid, but no matter how his legs moved, his upper body remained stable, with both hands always ready to fire. Behind them echoed Mason's furious roar. Mason, usually calm and gentle, was now in a fit of extreme rage. He couldn't comprehend why someone would devise such a cruel scheme, and that person was malicious enough to watch the results of their harm from a distance. Tiafu used the blood on her hand as ink, quickly drawing a few patterns on her right hand with her left. Then, she forcefully slammed her palm onto the ground. She didn't act together with Shadowless and Black Arrow, but as soon as her hand touched the ground, starting from her position, the earth suddenly swelled up, forming a straight line shooting in a particular direction. It was as if a snake was slithering underground, creating a wave of earth. But whether it was the swift Shadowless, Black Arrow's lightning-fast shots, or the earth snake conjured by Tiafu, none of them yielded any results. The perpetrator had vanished in the shortest amount of time. After all, the distance was too great, and the trio's efforts couldn't hold him back. Even though he had escaped, it didn't mean he had successfully gotten away, as Shadowless had memorized his aura. Moreover, Shadowless had a very vivid impression of that aura, indicating that the perpetrator was someone familiar to them, or at least someone they had met before. For now, however, the most crucial matter was deciding what to do about Manhwa. Everyone gathered around Manhwa, remaining silent for a long time. Without a chance to utter any final words, Manhwa passed away in an inexplicable manner. For someone who had spent half their life teetering between life and death, perhaps such a departure could be considered a form of peace. This was something